Oh, it seems I have a visitor this evening. Welcome. The night sky hangs clear and cold tonight, the aurora dancing green above the peaks. And I know you've come to rest beneath it. Take things slowly, and all will be well. I have some tales to share, ones that you may like. Tonight, we speak of the Dwemer, the deep elves, the dwarves of legend whose ruins still hum beneath the mountains, a whole people who vanished from the world in a single breath, leaving only riddles carved in brass. The dragons have returned to Skyrim, yet even they do not know where the dwarves went. Are you all settled for this night? Good. Long ago, before the age of men rose to claim the north, there lived a people who called themselves the Dwemer. Scholars will tell you the name carries the weight of the deep places of the earth, for the Mer of old used the word to mean the people of the deep. Yet the word held more than one shade of meaning. It spoke of deep delving, of profound thought, of matters kept close and quiet among their own kind, of counsel shared only in whispers behind stone doors. All of these meanings settled together into a single name, and that name belonged to a race of Mer who had once been part of the early Aldmer, the ancient elves from whom so many peoples of Tamriel descended. Others gave them other names, for every culture that met them came away with a different word to describe the strange folk who lived beneath the mountains. Some called them the deep elves, plain and simple. Others spoke of the deep folk, or the deep ones, or the people of the deep, all of them circling the same truth, that these were Mer who made their homes in the roots of the world rather than beneath the open sky. There were those who called them the under-elves, a name that placed them below the surface and below the other elves in the eyes of those who used it. And when the race of men came upon their works and their halls, men gave them the name that most folk still use around a hearth like this one. Men called them the dwarves. You may notice that I speak of them in fragments and in names, and there is a reason for that. Little was ever written down about where the Dwemer truly came from, or how their civilization first took root. They were remnants of the early Aldmer, and beyond that, the record grows thin and uncertain. Much of what survives about them is a record of their quarrels. There are accounts of their wars against other races, and accounts of the times they turned upon one another, clan against clan, city against city. The gentler details of their lives, the things a people might have written for the joy of writing, faded away with them. And so we are left with an image of a people bound to the underground, a people whose thoughts ran toward reason and toward machinery, toward the tapping of deep and hidden powers. They delved into the earth and built their halls in the darkness, and they kept their counsel close. To understand how such a people came to vanish from the face of Tamriel in a single moment, we must first walk through the great works they left behind, the brass and the steam, and the strange metal guardians that still stir in the ruins to this day. Deep beneath the volcanic peaks of Dwemereth, heavy bronze pipes run along the cavern ceilings, carrying boiling water and high-pressure steam. The Dwemer harnessed the intense heat of magma pools, directing it through massive pressure valves to power their underground cities. Giant cogs, some measuring 30 feet across, turn continuously within the carved stone walls. Thick metal grates cover deep shafts, where geothermal vents release plumes of white vapor into the wide corridors. The air smells heavily of sulfur, heated oil, and melted copper. Elaborate mechanical observatories sit in massive dome-shaped caverns, utilizing spinning armillary spheres and rotating brass rings to track the celestial bodies above the rock. Phosphorescent crystals and continuous gas-fed flames illuminate the polished stone floors, casting long shadows across the heavy metal doors. In the largest subterranean hangars, the Dwemer constructed enormous airships. Buoyed by large canvas envelopes filled with heated gas, these vessels featured wooden decks supported by thick brass ribs. Steam-powered propellers jutted from the sides, connected to complex gearboxes, allowing the ships to navigate the vast underground chasms and transport heavy loads of mined ore between city-states. Patrolling these illuminated halls are the animunculi, mechanical guardians constructed from a unique, gold-colored metal alloy. Spider-shaped constructs scuttle across the ceilings on pointed metallic legs, their central chassis housing glowing soul gems that emit a low, constant hum. Larger guardians, shaped like spheres, roll through the corridors on metal tracks. Upon detecting heavy footsteps, the spheres unfold, revealing a humanoid torso equipped with spinning blades and heavy mechanical bows. The most massive of these creations, the Centurions, stand at the entrances of great vaults. These towering figures release thick bursts of steam from their shoulder joints with every heavy step. They rotate their heavy metal heads, interpreting the movements of intruders through thick glass lenses, and swing heavy hammers with enough force to shatter solid stone. The machines follow precise patrols, responding to the presence of flesh and blood with immediate, calculated strikes. To forge these metal guardians and bend the earth to their design, the Dwemer utilized a discipline known as tonal architecture. They built massive tonal resonators, arrays of metal tuning forks, acoustic chambers, and curved brass horns that amplify specific acoustic frequencies. By striking these resonators with precisely measured force, they produced sound waves capable of altering the physical properties of the surrounding matter. The continuous vibrations reshaped solid rock, tempered metal relying entirely on sound waves, and suspended heavy stones in the air. The humming of these tonal machines reverberates through the floorboards, a constant mechanical drone that manipulates the fundamental laws of nature through pure mathematics and acoustics. This mastery of sound and machinery resulted in a physical endurance that withstands the passage of time. Water drips from the cavern ceilings, pooling around the metal fixtures, yet the brass-like alloy of the Dwemer machines maintains a pristine, polished sheen. The gears continue to rotate smoothly on their axles. Piston rods slide in and out of their cylinders with exact precision, thousands of years after their assembly. Scholars observe the untouched state of the ruins and document the presence of specific tonal devices hidden deep within the city structures. These machines emit a frequency that interacts with the earth bones, the fundamental laws governing Nern, actively suspending the natural processes of oxidation and rot within the boundaries of the Dwemer halls. Detailed schematics and records of these creations are stamped onto thin metal plates, covered entirely in the angular, geometric runes of the Dwemerist language. The letters consist of intersecting straight lines and sharp angles, carved deeply into stone tablets and brass pipes. Modern scholars run their fingers over the indentations, translating a very small fraction of the text. Most of the glyphs remain sealed from modern understanding, presenting complex mathematical formulas and tonal frequencies that stand entirely apart from all modern tongues. The ledgers sit on stone tables, documenting inventory, tonal measurements, and construction plans in a rigid, structural script. The underground cities expanded as the Dwemer built more mechanical guardians and laid down miles of steam pipes. The population grew, and the demand for new geothermal vents and unmined veins of ore drove the deep-delving clans to look beyond the borders of Dwemereth. Gathering their tools, their schematics, and their metal constructs, several factions prepared to leave their ancestral home. They marched toward the western mountains, carrying heavy warhammers and seeking fresh caverns to conquer and reshape. The Dwemer columns marched out of the eastern ashlands, their brass wagons carving deep ruts into the dirt. For many years, the clans remained within the borders of Dwemereth, cutting their cities into the basalt cliffs. Eventually, several clan leaders cast their gaze toward the western horizon. They desired new veins of ore, fresh geothermal vents, and wider caverns to house their growing machinery. The chieftain of the Rorken clan gathered his people in the shadow of the eastern mountains. He stood before his followers and gripped the handle of a massive warhammer forged of dark metal, a weapon called Volendrung. The chieftain hoisted Volendrung above his head, spun on his heels, and hurled the hammer into the sky. The weapon sailed across the clouds, tracing a high arc over the central plains and forests of Tamriel. The Rorken clan packed their tools, locked the heavy brass doors of their old holds, and walked in the direction of the hammer's flight. They crossed rivers and scaled mountain passes, following the path of Volendrung until they reached the arid deserts of the far west. There, half buried in the sand, they found their hammer. They claimed the surrounding desert and named their new home Volenfell, the city of the hammer. Centuries later, the men of the desert would translate that name, calling the entire region Hammerfell. Other clans observed the Rorken migration and prepared their own caravans. Clan Kragan loaded their tonal instruments and animunculi onto steam-driven carts. They steered their beasts of burden toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks of Skyrim. The Kragan engineers sought out a massive fissure in the earth, a place where boiling water bubbled up through the frost. They carved into the rock, expanding the natural caverns into wide, geometric halls. They laid bronze pipes to channel the boiling water, turning the geothermal pressure into power for their spinning gears and piston-driven doors. This subterranean fortress became Arkentham's, the first Dwemer city-state established in the northern province. The physical presence of the Dwemer drew the attention of the Nords living on the surface. Nordic raiding parties descended into the upper levels of Arkentham's, swinging iron axes against the brass plating of the city's gates. The Dwemer responded by releasing their animunculi. Brass spiders leaped from pipes in the walls, and massive centurions stepped out of their charging gantries, venting clouds of scalding steam. The dwarven machines crushed the wooden shields of the raiders and drove the Nords back to the surface. Arkentham's expanded deeper into the crust of the earth, its foundries burning hot as they manufactured more guardians to patrol the entrances. The expansion of Arkentham's prompted further expeditions from the east. More Dwemer clans crossed the borders into Skyrim, carrying blueprints for tonal architecture and crates of glowing soul gems. They located new subterranean chasms and established 3 more city-states beneath the frozen tundra. These 4 great strongholds shared resources, sending caravans of refined metal and Ethereum shards back and forth through a network of deep tunnels. The tunnels smelled of sulfur, hot grease, and the ozone crackle of active soul gems. Brass piping ran along the ceilings of these roads, providing light and heat to the traveling merchants. The 4 city-states combined to form a formidable underground territory, positioned deep below the blizzards and the wars raging on the surface. The Dwemer engineers built grand tonal resonators in their central plazas. These massive devices consisted of tuning forks and rotating bronze rings humming with precise frequencies. The sound waves manipulated the stone itself, softening the rock so the masons could shape perfect right angles and smooth archways. Water from underground rivers flowed through aqueducts, pouring over water wheels that turned the heavy cogs of their foundries. The Dwemer walked through these illuminated halls in robes of spun metal and thick leather, carrying measuring calipers and drafting tablets. As the Dwemer expanded their domain through the deep rock of Skyrim, they carved paths closer to the surface caves. The sounds of their grinding gears and hissing steam vents echoed up through the ice sheets. These mechanical echoes reached the ears of another race of elves, a people fleeing through the bitter snow, searching for a safe haven away from the axes of the Nords. The surface of Skyrim lay buried under thick sheets of glacial ice, and upon these frozen expanses walked the snow elves. They built towering structures from carved stone and sculpted ice, reflecting the sunlight across the northern valleys. White marble columns supported wide archways over paths paved with frost. The Merethic era saw these pale-skinned, white-haired Mer moving through the deep snows of the province, wrapping their bodies in pale silks and thick pelts. The other races called them Ice Elves. They hunted the wild beasts of the tundra and gathered around altars dedicated to their sun god, bowing their heads beneath the open sky. The wind carried the scent of pine and crisp ozone through their open-air settlements, rustling the banners that hung from their balconies. They walked the mountain ridges with light steps, leaving shallow prints in the snow crust as they surveyed the frozen landscape they claimed as their own. Their architects shaped light and magic into solid forms, filling the valleys with gleaming spires. Wooden longships struck the northern coastlines, scraping their hulls against the stony shores. Men from the continent of Atmora marched into the valleys, carrying heavy iron axes and thick wooden shields. The snow turned red as the two races clashed in the mountain passes. The men set fire to the white marble cities, sending thick columns of black smoke into the grey sky. The flames melted the ice sculptures, turning the pristine streets into rivers of ash and slush. By the time King Harold sat upon his throne in the year 1E 221, his armies drove the remaining ice elves away from the coastal plains and deep into the mountain crags. The Nords marched in tightly packed shield walls, shouting battle cries that echoed off the cliffs. The boots of the Atmorans trampled the delicate frost carvings into dust, and their iron blades cut down the retreating elves. The smell of burning wood and scorched stone replaced the crisp mountain air. Scattered pockets of snow elves fled into the most remote regions of the province. The survivors huddled together in shallow caves, shivering under torn cloaks. Frostbite blackened their fingers and toes, cracking the skin on their hands. They scraped moss from the undersides of rocks and chewed on dry pine needles to fill their stomachs. The blizzards battered their bodies, packing snow into their hair and freezing their eyelashes together. The Nords continued their patrols, sounding war horns that carried across the valleys and over the ridges. The Ice Elves walked constantly, leaving bloody footprints in the deep drifts as they searched the mountain ranges for any escape from the pursuing armies. The heavy snowfall buried the bodies of those who fell along the trail, leaving only the white expanse behind them. The survivors wrapped rags around their bleeding feet and pushed deeper into the blinding white storms. During their retreat, the desperate elves stumbled upon vents of hot steam rising through the snowpack. They followed the hissing pipes and the smell of sulfur down into the crevasses. Deep within the rock formations, they found massive doors constructed of solid bronze, secured with heavy gears and metal locking mechanisms. The refugees beat their frostbitten hands against the metal plates, pressing their faces to the warm metal. The heavy doors ground open on large hinges, scraping against the stone floor and releasing a blast of warm air and the smell of machine oil. The Dwemer stood on the other side, wearing their heavy metal armor and holding geometric staffs. Their brass helmets reflected the flickering light of the braziers behind them. The snow elves stepped inside the subterranean halls. The yellow light of geothermal lamps reflected off their pale faces. Brass pipes lined the stone walls, radiating heat that melted the ice from the refugees' clothing. Puddles of water formed around their boots as they stared down the long, metallic corridors. The Dwemer looked at the shivering, starving Mer standing in the entrance of their underground city. The two factions spoke over the rhythmic clanking of pistons and the rushing of underground rivers. The Dwemer offered the snow elves sanctuary within their deep caverns, far away from the axes of the Nords. They presented a pact, laying out the terms of this shelter, demanding complete submission and labor in exchange for safety. The fleeing elves accepted the offer, agreeing to live under the earth and rely entirely on the deep-delving architects for their survival. The bronze gates sealed shut with a loud clang, driving iron bolts deep into the rock, locking the refugees inside the mountain and setting the stage for a fate far worse than the cold axes waiting on the surface. The Dwemer led their guests deep into the subterranean vaults, pulling the heavy bronze levers to seal the massive stone gates behind them. The air in these lower levels smelled of sulfur and wet earth, heated by the geothermal vents sputtering along the rock walls. To feed the arriving masses, the Dwemer hosts brought forth heavy iron baskets filled with a specific subterranean fungus. The caps of these mushrooms glowed with a faint, sickly violet light in the dim tunnels. The snow elves consumed the pale, spongy flesh of the fungi. The toxins seeped into their bloodstreams and gathered in their optic nerves. A milky white film crept across the surface of their blue eyes, thickening daily. They stumbled through the brass corridors, their hands dragging along the scalding steam pipes and jagged stone walls to find their balance. The Dwemer masters fastened thick collars of brass and iron around the necks of their blinded guests. Metallic animunculi, driven by hissing pistons and spinning gears, marched the elves into the deepest mines of the city. The slaves swung heavy iron pickaxes against solid veins of ebony and dwarven metal. Rock dust coated their sweating skin, and their hands developed thick, cracking calluses. The Dwemer overseers struck the slaves with heated brass rods to keep the heavy mining carts rolling across the iron tracks. The slaves ate only the toxic violet fungi provided by their masters, and the poison settled permanently into their bodies, altering the physical structure of their offspring. Successive generations of these elves were born in the pitch-black crevices of the underground. Over decades, their physical forms adapted to the dark, cramped environment. Their spines curved forward into permanent hunches, shrinking their overall height and forcing their knuckles to drag across the stone. Their skin faded to a translucent white that exposed the blue veins pulsing underneath. Their ears elongated further and grew sharp points, twitching constantly to catch the hiss of steam valves and the scrape of the overseer's boots. Their teeth elongated into jagged, needle-like points, allowing them to tear into the raw, squirming flesh of the cave fish they pulled from the subterranean rivers. The white hair of their ancestors shed completely, leaving their scalps smooth, pale, and covered in sores. The physical contrast between the ancestors and the descendants became absolute. The ancient snow elves stood tall upon the surface glaciers, clad in pale glass armor, and wielding finely forged longswords under the sunlight. These new creatures crawled on all fours across the cavern floors, communicating through a series of sharp clicks, guttural hisses, and the scraping of stones against the walls. They harvested the chitinous plates from the giant venomous centipedes known as chorus, binding the hard shells to their bodies with animal sinew to create crude armor. They fashioned jagged blades and arrows from the bones of dead creatures and scraps of rusted metal found in the refuse piles. The other races of Tamriel gave these mutated, subterranean descendants the name Falmer. Deep within the sprawling Dwemer ruin of Erkingthand, the Falmer slaves worked hidden from the overseers. They gathered in a pitch-black cavern far below the main walking paths of their masters. Using stolen chisels, sharpened rocks, and sheer physical force, they scraped away at a colossal pillar of natural stone. Their elongated, clawed fingers traced the contours of the rock in total darkness, feeling the shapes and angles of the carving. Over many years, they sculpted the massive stone into the head of an ancient snow elf. They smoothed out the proud jawline and the high, aristocratic cheekbones, physically preserving the exact features of their original forms. For the eyes of the statue, they embedded two massive, perfectly cut gems known as the eyes of the Falmer. The heavy, faceted jewels caught the faint bioluminescence of the surrounding cave flora, glowing softly in the dark. The blind slaves ran their calloused hands over the cold stone face, tracing the features of the ancestors they remembered only through touch. As the Falmer population multiplied in the deepest, dampest corners of the Dwemer cities, they began to hoard their weapons of bone and chitin. The clicking and hissing grew louder, echoing up through the ventilation shafts and the bronze grates. Thousands of Falmer massed together in the deep tunnels, gripping their jagged swords and knocking arrows dipped in corrosive chorus venom. They scaled the vertical stone shafts leading to the Dwemer living quarters, their clawed hands and bare feet finding purchase in the small cracks of the rock. The Falmer poured through the brass archways, driving their bone blades through the gaps in the metal armor of the Dwemer guards. Thick blood spilled across the polished tonal grates and hissed against the hot steam pipes, marking the start of a massive, subterranean conflict. In the lowest mining tiers of the Dwemer cities, the slaves turned against their masters. The mutated descendants of the snow elves, now known as the Falmer, swung their heavy iron pickaxes at the brass legs of the automated guardians. They ripped jagged gears from the broken animunculi and used the sharp metal to sever the leather bindings on their wrists. They swarmed the steam-driven lifts, jamming the locking mechanisms with crushed stone. The War of the Crag commenced in the deep earth. This conflict took place entirely beneath the surface, fought in tight stone corridors and sprawling subterranean fungal forests. Giant glowing mushrooms provided a dim blue luminescence over the battlefield. The Dwemer utilized their thick brass armor and their automated ballistas to hold the main thoroughfares. They fired heavy bolts into the dark, relying on the predictable pathways of the stone roads. The Falmer adapted to the pitch-black environment. They used the hidden crevices and the natural fault lines of the earth. They climbed the sheer rock faces of Blackreach with their bare, calloused hands and dropped onto the Dwemer patrols from the stalactites above. The air in the caverns grew thick with the smell of burning oil, venting steam, and spilled blood. The loud clashing of bronze swords against scavenged iron hooks echoed down the deep tunnels. Decades passed, and the fighting continued, with both sides holding their ground. Generations of Falmer were born, lived, and died, holding the exact same bloody choke points. The Dwemer engineers built increasingly complex traps, sealing off entire wings of their cities behind heavy bronze doors locked by tonal resonance. The Falmer simply dug around the obstacles. They carved fresh tunnels through the solid rock with their hardened fingernails and tools crafted from the chitin of giant underground insects. They bred the venomous chaurus bugs and used the toxic spit to melt the hinges of the Dwemer gates. Far above this subterranean combat, isolated groups of original snow elves survived on the surface. High in the frozen peaks of the Forgotten Vale, the priests of the Chantry of Auriel walked across bridges of solid ice. They wore pristine white armor and prayed on open stone balconies, breathing in the cold mountain air. They drank from glacial streams and watched the auroras illuminate the sky. These priests retained their pale skin and their tall stature, living in complete isolation from the brutal devolution of their kin below. The Chantry remained peaceful, a quiet sanctuary among the frozen waterfalls, while the war in the deep earth raged on below the crust of the world. The fighting in the deep earth became a daily reality in Skyrim. The Falmer and the Dwemer engaged in a brutal, perpetual stalemate. The piles of shattered brass and crushed bone grew higher in the corridors with each passing century. This combat would persist right up until the exact moment the Dwemer vanished from the world, leaving the sightless slaves to inherit the empty cities. While the Falmer and the Dwemer fought continuously in the western holdings, the Dwemer clans in the eastern lands faced a very different struggle. In the ash-covered region of Resdain, the land known today as Morrowind, the eastern Dwemer built their cities under the shadow of the Great Red Mountain. They shared this territory with the Chimer, the golden-skinned ancestors of the Dark Elves. The Chimer raised their insect-shell tents on the surface and carved their temples into the towering basalt pillars. The Dwemer and the Chimer clashed constantly over the ash wastes. The Chimer wielded curved bone swords and summoned Daedric fire, while the Dwemer utilized their tonal architecture and steam-powered constructs. The smell of sulfur and burning chitin drifted across the plains during their border skirmishes. They fought for control of the mineral-rich territory, spilling blood over the volcanic glass and the pumice fields. Then, the heavy footfalls of a new army shook the ground. Men from the frozen north marched across the mountain passes, carrying heavy iron axes and wearing the thick pelts of snow bears. Far to the east of Skyrim, the ash of Red Mountain settled over the jagged landscape of Resdain. Giant fungal stalks grew from the grey soil, and massive insectoid creatures crawled through the deep canyons. The Dwemer held the subterranean spaces here, carving expansive halls of solid stone and sealing them with heavy brass doors. On the surface, another race of elves walked the ash plains. These were the Chimer, the ancestors of the Dark Elves. The Chimer possessed golden skin and sharp facial features, and they wore armor crafted from the molded chitin of giant insects and the bleached bones of beasts. The Chimer gathered around open fires, burning fragrant resins and chanting prayers to their Daedric gods. They built towering shrines of jagged obsidian and painted their faces with the grey ash of the mountain. Just below them, the Dwemer drove steam-powered drills into the crust of the earth and constructed geometric harvesting rigs of bronze and steel. The Dwemer measured the stars with metal astrolabes and redirected blistering magma flows through thick pipes. The two races clashed constantly over the territory and the resources of Resdain. Chimer warriors hurled spears of volcanic glass and channeled crackling lightning from their fingertips against the Dwemer perimeters. In response, Dwemer tonal architects deployed spheres of brass that opened into rolling constructs. The animunculi marched out of the subterranean gates. venting scalding steam and firing heavy crossbow bolts into the Chimer ranks. The golden-skinned elves bled onto the ash wastes, and the mechanical guardians lay in scattered pieces across the jagged rocks. The Chimer viewed the Dwemer machines as a direct affront to their gods, while the Dwemer stripped the Daedric shrines for raw stone to build their aqueducts. Then, ships of wooden planks and iron rivets breached the northern coastlines. Pale-skinned men with braided hair waded through the surf, clutching heavy steel axes and round shields. These were the Nords, marching east from the frozen valleys of Skyrim. They wore thick pelts of bears and wolves over rings of iron mail. As they advanced across the ash plains, they roared words of power that shattered the Chimer chitin armor and dented the brass plating of the Dwemer constructs. The Nords cut down the fungal stalks to build their timber longhouses and stacked loose stones into fortresses directly over the contested territories. The Nordic armies pushed deep into Resdain, forcing the Chimer into the deepest fungal forests and the most remote canyons. At the exact same time, the Nordic warbands besieged the Dwemer strongholds, using heavy battering rams of solid oak to pound against the brass gates. The Nords claimed the surface, digging their boots into the grey soil and lighting massive bonfires that sent columns of black smoke into the sky. The air filled with the smell of roasting meat and burning wood. The Chimer scouts watched the Nords occupy their hunting grounds from the high cliffs, while the Dwemer tonal architects monitored the vibrations of the Nordic siege engines through their subterranean acoustic pipes. The golden-skinned elves and the deep-dwelling elves found themselves pinned by the exact same invading army. The Nords slaughtered the Chimer raiding parties and dismantled the Dwemer surface harvesters to forge new weapons. Under the weight of the Nordic steel, the two elven factions realized they needed to combine their strength to survive. Chimer messengers wrapped in grey cloaks walked down into the craters and approached the heavy brass doors of the Dwemer holds. They carried banners of truce made of woven silk. The Dwemer gears turned, and the heavy doors slid open, releasing thick clouds of white steam. The leaders of the Chimer, armed with bone-hilted blades, stepped into the metallic halls to stand face to face with the Dwemer lords, who wore heavy bronze beards and geometric plating. Together they looked at the maps of Resdain, spread across a table of bronze, pointing their armored fingers at the Nordic camps marked across the territory, and they began to forge a unified plan of attack. The Nordic armies marched across the jagged borders of Morrowind in the year 416 of the First Era. They wore heavy iron plates, thick animal pelts, and carried broad steel axes that caught the low sunlight. Their iron-shod boots trampled the ash-covered soil, kicking up grey clouds that settled over the corpses of the fallen. They left burning Chimer camps and shattered Dwemer outposts scattered across the valleys. The smoke from these fires drifted across the landscape, carrying the scent of charred wood and scorched flesh. The invading forces pushed deeper into the territory, claiming the land piece by piece. This advancing threat forced the Chimer and the Dwemer to stand in the same room. Indoril Nerevar led the Chimer. He wore armor forged from hardened insect chitin and carried a curved blade strapped to his waist. His skin was the color of pale ash, and his eyes reflected the light like polished stones. Dumak Dwarfking led the Dwemer. He wore thick layers of brass and steel, with copper wires intricately braided through his heavy beard. The two leaders met in a deep subterranean chamber, lit by the orange glow of geothermal vents. The heat pressed heavily against their skin, causing sweat to run down their necks. Droplets of condensation gathered on the bronze pipes running along the ceiling. There, they spoke, shared cups of water, and formed the first council. They rolled out heavy sheets of parchment across a stone table and drew new borders with dark ink, combining their territories into a single nation called Resdain. Nerevar and Dumak clasped forearms, their grip tight and firm. They drank from the same metal chalices and stood shoulder to shoulder at the head of their combined armies. Nerevar's generals watched Dumak's tonal architects repair massive siege engines with brass wrenches and glowing soul gems. Dumak's guards watched Kaima priests apply herbal salves to the wounds of fallen soldiers and chant over their resting bodies. The combined military forces marched toward the Nordic camps. Dwemer animunculi rolled over the ash dunes, venting thick plumes of white steam into the dry air. Copper spheres unfolded into spinning blades that sliced through the scrub brush. Heavy brass centurions marched in perfect unison, their massive hammers striking the frozen earth with a deafening rhythm. Beside them, Kaima warriors moved quickly through the dust, firing arrows from curved bone bows and casting concentrated bursts of fire from their palms. The Nordic lines broke under the crushing weight of the metal constructs and the searing heat of the spells. Brass hammers shattered iron shields, and Kaima blades pierced through thick leather armor. The Nords fled across the mountain passes, leaving their banners, broken axes, and wounded warriors buried in the ash. The Dwemer and Kaima forces reclaimed the valleys, securing the borders of Resdain and driving the invaders back into the snow-covered peaks of Skyrim. Following the retreat of the invaders, the Kaima and Dwemer brought their goods together in shared markets. Kaima architects raised tall, organic towers of sculpted mushroom and bone, while Dwemer engineers laid precise gridworks of bronze pipes, stone aqueducts, and paved roads right beside them. Kaima merchants walked freely through the subterranean Dwemer arcades, their silk robes brushing against the metal walls. They traded jars of scrib jelly, bundled spices, and spun tapestries for finely tuned astrolabes, copper gears, and steam-heated basins. The two peoples ate at the same long wooden tables in the market squares. The high, clear notes of Kaima stringed instruments mingled with the deep, rhythmic thrum of Dwemer steam engines pumping water from the deep reservoirs. Nerevar and Dumak maintained their alliance, meeting regularly in the grand halls of the capital to exchange gifts and share meals. They presented each other with masterfully crafted weapons and ornate jewelry, cementing their bond in the eyes of their followers. During this prolonged peace, the Dwemer turned their vast resources toward the deep places of the earth. They expanded their mining operations far below the surface. Down in the deepest levels of the crust, beneath the towering volcanic peak of Red Mountain, Dwemer miners drove their picks into the dense, igneous rock. They set up heavy mechanical drills, pumping high-pressure steam into the pistons to crack the stone apart. The cavern air grew thick with the smell of sulfur and pulverized dust. The workers hauled away iron carts filled with obsidian and raw ore. They dug deeper than anyone had ever ventured, descending into a cavern where the ambient heat warped the air and the ground vibrated under their heavy boots. There, buried entirely inside the solid rock of the mountain, the metal drill bits struck something smooth, strange, and dense enough to shatter their hardened steel tools. Miners drove their bronze picks into the walls beneath the crust of Red Mountain. Ash and pumice coated their skin, and the air in the deep shafts carried the sharp scent of sulfur and molten iron. Sweat dripped from their chins as they expanded the tunnels downward, cutting through thick layers of igneous rock and packed basalt. During one of these deep excavations, a miner drove his heavy iron spike into a wall of solid obsidian. The rock fractured, and a brilliant red glow spilled through the fissure. The workers brought up heavy bronze levers to widen the gap, pushing aside massive slabs of black stone, and stepped into a vast natural cavern. In the center of the chamber rested a colossal stone. The surface of the object expanded and contracted in a steady, rhythmic motion. Thick veins of unknown minerals pulsed along its exterior. A low hum emanated from the object, vibrating through the metal tools in the miners' hands and resonating deep within their chests. The stone bled a thick, shimmering liquid that pooled around its base and evaporated into crimson steam, rising toward the vaulted ceiling of the cavern. Word of the discovery reached the upper levels of the Dwemer cities, prompting Kagranak, the high priest and chief tonal architect, to descend into the tunnels. Kagranak wore heavy robes of spun brass and carried an array of tuning forks and measuring calipers hanging from his leather belt. He approached the bleeding stone and placed a long brass rod directly against its surface. The rod vibrated violently, producing a tone that shattered the glass lanterns held by the nearby miners. Kagranak recorded the frequencies on a slate board, matching the wavelengths against ancient cosmological charts. Through his measurements and observation of the object's resonance, Kagranak identified the stone as the physical heart of Lorcan. Ancient records describe the origin of this heart in stark, physical terms. Long ago, the entity known as Lorcan convinced the other Aedra to combine their essence to build the physical mass of the mortal realm. After the land masses and oceans took shape, the Aedra gathered around Lorcan. They used their hands and weapons to tear the physical heart from his chest. Blood poured from the open wound as they cast the severed organ down from the sky. The heart plummeted toward Nirn, trailing a wake of fire and ash. It struck the ground with enough force to shatter the continental plates, pushing magma to the surface and forming the towering, jagged peak of Red Mountain around the impact crater. The heart remained buried under the hardened crust, continuing to beat in the darkness for millennia. Kagranak stood before the beating mass and began to formulate a design to harness its output. As the chief tonal architect, he held authority over the Dwemer's study of sound and natural law. He returned to his drafting chambers and unrolled wide sheets of vellum across heavy oak tables. Using dark ink and geometric compasses, he drew the schematics for an immense construct. This machine would be called the Numidium, the brass god. He sketched jointed metal limbs the size of towers and a hollow torso reinforced with thick bronze plating. Kagranak planned to place the heart of Lorcan inside the chest cavity of this towering golem, using the raw output of the divine organ to power the network of gears and pistons. To execute this design, Kagranak summoned the highest-ranking tonal architects to the deep cavern. Dozens of Dwemer scholars arrived carrying sounding tubes, brass resonators, and heavy calculation engines. They constructed iron scaffolds around the perimeter of the crater and laid down copper pipes to funnel the escaping crimson steam. Steam powered their analytical engines, causing the brass pistons to pump in exact time with the thumping of the heart. The architects struck the stone with specialized mallets and recorded the reverberations on spinning wax cylinders. They captured the escaping fluids in glass vials and watched the liquid react to different acoustic frequencies. The cavern filled with the clatter of machinery, the scratching of quills on parchment, and the relentless, echoing thud of the heart. The tonal architects compiled their data and presented their findings to the leaders of their clans. The measurements confirmed the heart emitted a continuous, limitless supply of energy. By directing specific tones at the tissue, they could extract fragments of this power and alter the fundamental properties of the physical world. The architects looked beyond the construction of a single brass machine. They calculated the precise frequencies required to channel the heart's energy directly into their own bodies, gathering the necessary metals and drafting the rituals to ascend beyond their mortal forms. Deep beneath the crust of Red Mountain, the tonal architects gathered around the petrified mass of Lorcan's heart. They set up heavy brass tripods upon the uneven cavern floor and mounted steam-driven measuring lenses to examine the artifact. Scribes dragged chalk across wide slate boards, recording the visual distortions and the heavy heat waves radiating off the stone. The engineers struck large tonal tuning forks against obsidian anvils, documenting the resulting vibrations that echoed through the massive chamber. Kagranak stood at the center of the operation, unrolling wide parchment schematics across long basalt tables. He calculated the frequency of the earth bones, observing the fundamental magical currents that held the surrounding volcanic rock together. The architects measured the energy flowing from the heart, treating the bleeding mass of a dead god as a raw mechanical component, ready to be processed and utilized. The scholars brought thick, leather-bound ledgers into the chamber, writing down the power outputs observed from the heart. They cross-referenced these measurements with the documented physical manifestations of the Aedra and Daedra. The Dwemer viewed the deities worshipped by the Chimera and other races as biological anomalies, plotting their capabilities on graphs, charts, and mathematical matrices. In their grand halls, the deep elves drew diagrams placing their own race above these documented entities. They built steam-pressurized simulation chambers in the adjoining tunnels, striking tonal resonators to test the effects of divine frequency on mortal matter. The tonal architects sought a precise mathematical formula to alter the physical bodies of the Dwemer. They worked to construct a tonal process that would instill their physical forms with cellular immortality and limitless magical capacity. Kagranak moved between the drafting tables, drawing the outlines of a colossal construct. He drafted highly detailed blueprints, showing a massive humanoid frame composed of bronze plating, interlocking gears, and heavy pneumatic joints. He labeled this towering design the Anumidium. His chalk lines detailed a series of tonal equations meant to link the minds and bodies of the entire Dwemer race to this single machine. By channeling the raw frequency of the heart into the central chest cavity of the brass body, Kagranak planned to merge his people into a unified, immortal entity. He wrote out the specific tonal frequencies required to bind the biological Dwemer essence to the brass skin of the golem. These blueprints soon covered the high walls of his sanctum, mapping out a giant that would stand taller than the cavern ceilings, designed to walk the earth with the collective intelligence of the entire Deep Elf civilization. Giant foundries ignited in the lower levels, casting the first massive brass toes and heel joints of the machine. This extensive planning and the ignition of the heavy foundries caused immediate friction among the ranks of the engineers. Several tonal architects set their tuning forks down and stepped back from the drafting tables. They pointed at the raw power fluctuations recorded on the slate boards and traced their fingers along the volatile resonance equations. They demonstrated the instability of the earth bones within the cavern, dropping weights and plucking strings to show how altering the frequency of the heart could shatter the physical structure of the Dwemer form. Factions formed across the stone floors of the research chambers. Some engineers packed up their calipers, their compasses, and their glass lenses, leaving the central cavern entirely. They gathered in the outer tunnels, speaking in hushed tones, trading slates filled with calculations that predicted catastrophic structural failure for the entire race. Kagranax ignored the departing engineers and the cessation of their work, remaining seated at his basalt table. He struck his tuning forks repeatedly, adjusting the metal prongs until they matched the exact pitch of the heart's continuous vibrations. He calculated the precise amount of physical force needed to extract the divine energy from the artifact without destabilizing the source. The raw flesh of the heart pulsed with a frequency too intense for bare hands or ordinary metals to handle. The ambient heat and the magical radiation within the central chamber warped the standard brass and iron tools brought near the artifact. The energy cracked the thick crystal lenses of the measuring devices and melted the tips of the iron rods used to prod the stone flesh. Kagranax swept the ruined instruments off his table and unrolled a fresh sheet of parchment. He realized that tapping the heart safely required instruments forged from heavily enchanted materials, capable of conducting the divine resonance without melting or shattering. He dipped his quill in ink and began drafting 3 new schematics, outlining a set of specific implements designed to strike, cut, and contain the raw power of the artifact. Deep within the magma chambers of Red Mountain, Lord Kagranax stood before an anvil of black iron. Rivers of molten rock flowed through stone trenches on either side, casting a thick orange light across the cavern. The heat in the room baked the moisture from the air, cracking the lips of the Dwemer smiths and turning their tunics dark with sweat. Steam hissed from heavy brass pipes lining the walls, venting the pressure building beneath the earth. Kagranax needed to harness the raw, bleeding energy of the heart of Lorcan to fuel the ascension of his people. The flesh of a Mer would incinerate upon contact with such power. He required physical instruments to shape the divine energy. He gathered the rarest ores from the deep veins of Dwemereth, combining tonal metals with volcanic glass and meteoric iron. Over the course of many weeks, the chief tonal architect swung his hammer against the glowing metals, shaping 3 distinct artifacts upon the anvil. The first artifact emerged from the cooling troughs as a heavy, articulated gauntlet. Kagranax named it Wraithguard. The gauntlet consisted of thick, interlocking plates of brass and gold-hued metal, covering the hand, wrist, and forearm. Intricate geometric patterns covered the dorsal plates, and small crystal prisms rested within the knuckles. Wraithguard served as a physical buffer between the wearer and the staggering energy of the heart. When a Dwemer secured the straps around their arm, the gauntlet established a tonal field around the physical form of the wearer. The metal absorbed thermal shocks and kinetic vibrations, channeling the raw power of a god through the geometric patterns carved into the plating. The thick shielding ensured the flesh of the wearer remained intact when wielding the forces necessary for their grand design. Next, Kagranax forged a striking instrument to command the output of the heart. He pulled a dense block of alloy from the forge and pounded it into a broad, rectangular hammer. This was Sunder. The hammer featured a wide, flat striking face and a thick handle wrapped in metallic mesh. Deep grooves ran along the sides of the head, designed to catch and amplify sound waves. Sunder weighed heavily in the hand, requiring immense physical strength to lift and swing. Kagranax designed the hammer to strike the heart directly. The physical impact of Sunder against the divine flesh produced a specific frequency, dictating the exact volume and quality of power released into the chamber. Each strike sent ripples of raw energy outward, and Sunder absorbed the recoil, vibrating intensely from the head down to the mesh-wrapped grip. The heavy impacts forced the heart to yield its stored power in measured, controllable bursts. To refine the chaotic bursts of energy produced by Sunder, Kagranak shaped a third tool from a single, massive piece of crystalline volcanic glass. He ground the edges on spinning whetstones until the material formed a short, double-edged blade. He named this blade keening. The blade possessed a translucent, pale blue tint, and a handle of spun brass secured the base. A constant, high-pitched hum emanated from the sharp edges of the glass, causing the air around the weapon to shimmer and blur. Kagranak crafted keening to flay and focus the power drawn by the hammer. After Sunder struck the heart to release the energy, the wielder would use keening to slice through the transparent currents of power, carving the raw energy into precise, usable streams. The crystalline structure of the blade acted as a prism, taking the wide shockwaves of sound and light and focusing them into narrow, concentrated beams. The sheer density of the energy coursing through Sunder and keening made them fatal to hold with bare hands. Grasping the mesh handle of the hammer or the brass hilt of the blade with bare skin causes the veins to boil and the bones to vibrate until they crumble into white ash. The user must wear Wraithguard to handle the striking tools safely. The gauntlet intercepts the lethal frequencies traveling down the handles, grounding the destructive resonance before it travels into the nervous system of the wielder. Kagranak tested the sequence carefully, sliding his left arm into Wraithguard, fastening the leather bindings, and lifting Sunder with the plated fingers. He then picked up keening with the same shielded hand, inspecting the edges for any flaws in the craftsmanship. The chief tonal architect laid the three tools inside a heavy brass carrying case lined with padded velvet. He secured the latches and lifted the container by its thick handle. The heat of the magma channels continued to bake the cavern walls as Kagranak walked away from the forge. He carried the artifacts down a long, sloped corridor built from smooth stone blocks, heading deeper into the crust of Red Mountain. Steam vents opened and closed in a rhythmic cycle along the path, filling the hallway with thick white clouds. He walked toward the primary construction chamber, where thousands of Dwemer engineers welded plates of bronze and copper onto the frame of a colossal humanoid machine. Deep within the lowest, magma-heated caverns of Red Mountain, the Dwemer assembled a towering structure of brass and bronze. Tonal architects walked along suspended iron scaffolding, striking tuning forks against massive gears and locking thick metal plates into place with heavy rivets. The cavern echoed with the hiss of escaping steam, the grinding of overlapping cogs, and the heavy ringing of hammers against metal. At the center of this vast, sweltering space stood a colossal construct shaped in the image of a mer, reaching hundreds of feet toward the jagged stone ceiling. The Dwemer called this creation the Numidium. They also referred to it as Anumidium, the prime gestalt, the divine skin, and the brass god. The Numidium rested on massive mechanical legs, supported by thick iron chains and steam-powered winches anchored to the cavern walls. Its body consisted of thousands of interlocking brass panels, each one engraved with precise geometric patterns and tonal equations. Gears the size of chimera dwellings rotated slowly within its open chest cavity, dripping with thick, dark lubricating oil. Pipes pumped superheated vapor through its jointed limbs, powering mechanisms designed to crush solid stone and level entire city walls with a single swing. Lord Kagranak designed this titanic machine to function as a deity constructed entirely of metal and driven by the strict mathematical laws of tonal architecture. At the core of the Numidium's chest cavity, A specialized housing chamber awaited the placement of the heart of Lorcan. The Dwemer built this central vault to channel the frequencies of the divine stone directly into the brass god's chassis. Kagrenax intended to use his 3 enchanted tools to strike the heart and flood the Numidium with raw, unbridled energy. This energy would course through the brass veins and conductive rods of the construct, animating the giant figure and granting it the power to alter the physical laws of the world through manipulated sound waves. The tonal architects constructed the Numidium as a weapon of devastating capability. They built it to conquer the land of Resdain, ensuring absolute Dwemer dominance over all other races on the surface. By operating a god of their own making, the Dwemer planned to enforce their exact will upon the physical realm, shaping mountains and valleys to their precise specifications. Furthermore, Kagrenax designed the prime gestalt to act as a metaphysical vessel for the entire Dwemer race. The tonal architects theorized that the frequency of the heart, amplified through the Numidium's brass body, could rewrite their mortal limitations. They sought to bind their own physical forms and souls to the brass god, achieving immortality by fusing their collective existence into the divine skin. To prepare the Numidium for the heart of Lorcan, the tonal architects performed continuous, exacting rituals involving deep harmonic resonances. The process required the extraction and refinement of raw soul energy to prime the massive soul gems embedded in the machine's joints and ocular receptors. Dwemer workers hauled iron carts filled with charged gems up the wooden ramps and scaffolding, slotting them directly into the construct's limbs with heavy tongs. Golden light spilled from the seams of the brass plating, reflecting off the dark volcanic rock of the cavern and illuminating the falling ash. The sheer scale of the project consumed the resources of entire Dwemer city-states, requiring constant shifts of miners, smiths, and tonal engineers working through the blistering heat of the mountain. The Dwemer kept the construction of the brass god strictly contained within the sealed vaults of Red Mountain. Heavy bronze doors, locked by complex tonal puzzles, blocked the assembly chambers from the outer tunnels, and mechanical centurions patrolled the corridors leading to the central cavern. The noise of the construction blended with the natural tremors and volcanic eruptions of the mountain, masking the sound of the hammers and steam engines from anyone on the surface. Inside the vault, the tonal architects continued their exact calculations, striking the heart of Lorcan with sunder and focusing the resulting energy waves with keening, all while wearing the protective gauntlet Wraithguard to ensure their physical forms remained intact while handling the stone. Despite the thick stone walls and the mechanical guardians, the vibrations of the tonal work carried through the dense basalt of the volcano. The immense surge of magical energy generated by the heart of Lorcan left glowing crystalline traces in the surrounding minerals and disrupted the natural flow of magicka across the ash wastes. Spies and scouts moving through the region observed the heavy, continuous shipments of brass, bronze, and soul gems vanishing into the Dwemer strongholds. The sheer volume of material moving underground drew the attention of those living alongside the Dwemer in Resdain, prompting House Dagoth to send their most skilled observers deep into the subterranean passages to uncover the source of the mechanical rumblings. Deep within the lower lava tubes of Red Mountain, Lord Vorin Dagoth walked through the shadowed, sulfur-scented tunnels. As the leader of House Dagoth and a trusted general of Indoril Nerevar, Vorin maintained scouts near the glowing Dwemer foundries. His scouts brought him sheets of stamped copper and rolled parchment stolen from the outer workshops. Vorin Dagoth unrolled the heavy schematics on a flat basalt slab. The drawings depicted a colossal skeletal structure, with gears the size of settlement buildings and a central chest cavity designed to house a single, massive stone. Alongside these blueprints, Vorin Dagoth read the translated notes of the chief tonal architect, Kagranak. The text detailed a glowing, bleeding rock dug from the deep crust, pulsing with an internal rhythm. The Dwemer texts named it the Heart of Lorcan. The diagrams outlined the precise methods the tonal architects would use to siphon the power of this relic into a chassis of solid brass. Kagranax intended to build a towering mechanical god powered by the core of the world itself. Vorin Dagoth gathered these copper plates and scrolls, packed them into cured leather tubes, and rode down the ashen slopes of the mountain to the capital. He carried the evidence directly into the high halls of the Chimere. The large meeting room smelled of burning incense and polished chitin armor. Vorin laid the blueprints out on a long carved obsidian table before Indoril Nerevar and the leaders of the great houses. The tall, golden-skinned Chimera lords leaned over the stone table. They traced the etched lines of the giant brass limbs and read the translations of Kagranak's tonal formulas. The Chimera worshipped the Daedric princes and revered the spirits of their ancestors. They built shrines of carved bone and volcanic ash, offering blood and prayer to the entities of the realms beyond. The papers on the table showed a machine designed to harness a creator deity's remains. The schematics outlined a process of manufacturing divinity through steam, tonal resonance, and stolen divine flesh. The leaders of the great houses stepped back from the table. They shouted across the cavernous hall. Councillors slammed their bare fists against the obsidian stone, knocking over goblets of dark wine. Generals drew their curved swords and drove the steel tips into the wooden floorboards. They demanded an immediate muster of the house armies. They demanded the destruction of the Dwemer strongholds across the region. They called for the slaughter of the tonal architects and the complete dismantling of the brass machine before Kagranak could awaken it. Nerevar stood at the head of the table. He looked at the blueprints of the brass construct and the descriptions of the bleeding stone. Nerevar shared a close, documented friendship with the Dwemer king, Dumak Dwarf King. Nerevar and Dumak had sworn blood oaths and exchanged gifts of enchanted metal and carved bone. They had fought side by side against the invading Nords and built the first council together, signing treaties that bound their people in peace. Nerevar listened to the shouts of his generals and the loud demands of the great house lords. The noise in the hall grew as weapons clashed and armored boots stamped on the stone floor. Nerevar raised his hand and ordered the room to silence. Before he would authorize the marching of the Chimera hosts, Nerevar commanded his generals to hold their forces at the borders of the Ashlands. He rolled up the stamped copper sheets and the stolen parchments, sliding them back into the leather tubes. He fastened his chitin armor, secured his weapons to his belt, and called for his mount. He would take the evidence directly to Dumak. He would walk into the Dwemer halls, lay the blueprints before his friend, and demand a clear explanation for the giant brass limbs and the beating stone hidden beneath the mountain. In the year 1E668, Indoril Nerevar walked through the high, vaulted corridors of a Dwemer stronghold, leaving his honor guard waiting at the outermost gates. He stepped into the central meeting hall, a room lit by the harsh, steady glow of geothermal lamps. Dumak Dwarf King stood at the far end of a long stone table, his hands resting flat on the polished surface. Chief Tonal Architect Kagranak stood a few paces behind him, partially covered by the thick white steam venting from a nearby copper pipe. Nerevar spoke, his voice bouncing off the brass-plated walls, laying out the accounts he had heard regarding the heart of Lorcan and the construction of a mechanical god. He asked Dumak to explain the massive project beneath the volcano and requested the Dwemer halt their tapping of the deep powers. Dumak crossed his arms over his broad chest, the heavy metal of his gauntlets scraping together. He looked directly at Nerevar, maintaining a rigid, unyielding posture. Dumak commanded the tonal architects to continue their work. He voiced his total support for Kagranak and the scholars of his people, standing by his own kin over the treaties of the First Council. Nerevar took a step forward, his palms open, asking his old friend to remember the vows they had spoken aloud when they united their peoples against the Nordic invaders. Dumak slowly shook his head. He lowered his thick hand and placed it on the leather-wrapped hilt of his warhammer, the metal rings of his sleeves clinking against his thick belt. The two leaders stared at each other across the polished stone floor. The rhythmic hissing of the steam vents filled the quiet space between them. Nerevar turned on his heel and walked out through the heavy bronze doors, his heavy boots ringing loudly against the metal floorboards. The First Council ended in that room. The physical division spread rapidly across the land of Resdane. Khymer workers packed their chisels and hammers and walked away from the shared settlements. Dwemer engineers pulled the massive iron levers that sealed the tall bronze gates of their underground cities, sliding the heavy locking bolts into place. Shared banners made of woven silk and spun brass were pulled down from the stone parapets and thrown onto the dirt. On the surface, the Khymer prepared for open conflict. Nerevar called the great houses to assemble their forces. Thousands of Khymer warriors marched onto the ash-swept plains, kicking up massive clouds of grey dust with their marching feet. They erected sprawling war camps, pitching tents made from the thick, hardened shells of giant insects and layers of heavy woven cloth. Large bonfires burned throughout the night, casting long, flickering shadows across the encampments. The air filled with the sharp, scraping sounds of whetstones sliding along the curved edges of swords, accompanied by the dull thuds of wooden practice spears striking leather shields. Khymer smiths stood by open flames, hammering out sheets of chitin armor and carving tips onto bone-molded spears. Below the earth, Dumak ordered his clans to ready themselves for a massive siege. The Dwemer opened their deepest storage vaults, rolling giant bronze spheres into the main thoroughfares. Tonal architects moved through the ranks, using heavy steel wrenches to tighten the pressure valves on the mechanical spiders. The brass joints of the constructs clanked and clicked as they powered on, their glass optical sensors glowing with a pale yellow light. Ranks of Dwemer soldiers, clad from head to toe in thick, geometrically cut metal plating, marched in perfect unison through the gas-lit corridors. The smell of burning oil and raw sulfur filled the caverns as the subterranean forges operated continuously, pouring out fresh battle axes and replacement gears for the machines. The gathering of these two massive forces completely transformed the landscape. The Khymer host stretched far across the horizon, forming a vast sea of chitin-armored soldiers brandishing spears and longswords. Nerevar walked among his troops, inspecting their front lines and handing orders to his unit commanders. He stood alongside his top generals, looking out over the assembled might of his people. At the same time, Dumak stood upon an elevated metal balcony inside his mountain fortress, watching the endless columns of brass machines and armored mer form up in the wide staging areas. Both armies stood fully mobilized, their weapons drawn and their ranks tightened. Nerevar lifted his curved blade, and pointed its tip toward the towering, smoke-plumed peak of the great volcano in the center of the land, signaling his commanders to begin the long march forward. Volcanic ash drifts down from a grey sky, coating the massed ranks of the Khmer armies as they stand before the jagged basalt slopes of Red Mountain. Golden-skinned warriors strap on overlapping bone mold plates and secure thick chitin helmets under their chins. Leather belts are pulled tight, and hands grip the leather-wrapped hilts of obsidian swords. Gua mounts stamp their heavy, clawed feet in the thick dust, shaking their metal bits and leather reins. Plumes of yellow sulfur vent from the cracks in the earth, carrying the sharp scent of rotten eggs across the valley. At the front of the gathered host, Indaril Nerevar holds his flaming sword, True Flame. The fire rolling off the jagged edge casts flickering orange light across the faces of the commanders standing at his side. To his left stands Vorin Dagoth, the lord of his house. Vorin wears heavy, polished chitin armor, with the beetle-like crest of his family painted in thick red ochre across his chest plate. He holds a tall shield, tapping his mace against the rim to signal his retainers. Beside him, Almalexia adjusts the leather grips on her jewel-curved blades. She wears a tightly fitted war harness, her golden armor reflecting the dull red glow emanating from the mountain's distant crater. Her golden hair is tied back with thick leather cords, keeping it clear of her shoulders. Vivek rests the shaft of his long spear against a block of pumice stone. He stands bare-chested in the ashfall, a length of grey cloth wrapped tightly around his waist and legs, his golden skin stained with soot. Sotha Sil holds a heavy roll of vellum schematics in his hands. He traces a calloused finger along the faded ink lines, detailing the mountain's known steam vents and brass doors, occasionally adjusting the bronze tools hanging from his heavy leather belt. Nerevar raises his burning blade high and points the tip toward the ridges above. The Khmer troops march forward in unison. Their heavy boots crunch over the sharp volcanic glass and loose pumice stone. Up on the steep basalt cliffs, heavy brass Dwemer ballistae lock into place with loud, echoing metallic clacks. Bronze spiders scuttle out from dark crevices, their segmented metal legs clicking rapidly against the stone. Khmer archers draw back their bowstrings and release dense volleys of arrows into the air. The flint-tipped arrows spark and shatter against the thick brass plating of the descending Dwemer machines. Bone maces swing, crushing the delicate internal gears of the metallic spiders. Ruptured pipes hiss violently, spraying clouds of scalding steam over the Khmer vanguard. Giant centipedes made of segmented bronze uncoil from stone alcoves, swinging heavy metal spheres at the advancing warriors. Khmer soldiers slip on the slick rocks, their golden blood pooling in the grey ash as they force their way up the incline. While the main body of the army battles entirely on the exposed slopes, engaging the endless stream of mechanical guardians, Nerevar breaks away from the front line. He signals to Vorin Dagoth and a small, select group of retainers. They move swiftly along a narrow mountain ledge, slipping entirely past the massive external gates where the fighting is thickest. They approach a smaller, heavy brass door set deeply into the sheer rock face. Vorin Dagoth presses his armored shoulder against the metal, pushing the door open on loudly grinding hinges. The group steps out of the cold ash wind and into the baking heat of the subterranean tunnels. The air inside smells strongly of hot copper, burning oil, and stale ozone. They walk across iron grates, moving deeper into the mountain, leaving the shouts and the clash of the surface war behind them. In the centuries that follow, scribes sitting at wooden desks will scrape ink across parchment to record the events of this specific day. These scholars turn the dry pages of bound codices and point to lines of text written in vastly different hands. The ink marks completely contradict one another. One heavy vellum scroll depicts Nerevar marching into the mountain, accompanied only by Vorin Dagoth. Another cracked leather book shows detailed ink drawings of a Khajiit named Drosera leaping onto Dwemer constructs inside the mountain. A third manuscript features jagged runic letters detailing Wulfharth, a Nord king, shouting the brass doors off their hinges with frost magic. The physical records diverge entirely, presenting different weapons, different faces, and different paths taken in the dark. The wax seals on these historical documents bear different house sigils, and the bound pages present separate journeys leading to the exact same destination. Beneath the mountain, Nerevar and his confidants continue down the dimly lit corridor. Brass lanterns cast long, shifting shadows against the heavily riveted walls. The metal plates beneath their boots hum with deep, steady vibrations. Ahead, a heavy thumping sound echoes down the length of the tunnel, shaking the dust from the low ceiling. The rhythmic beating exactly matches the pulse of a massive, living heart. They step carefully over rotating cogs embedded in the floor and approach the final, towering set of brass doors, where the chief tonal architect waits inside. Volcanic ash fell across the jagged slopes of Red Mountain in thick, grey sheets as the Khmer and Dwemer forces clashed. Khmer warriors drove their bone-molded weapons and chitin spears against the heavy bronze plating of Dwemer animunculi. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes, and gears ground against volcanic stone. Giant mechanical centurions swung massive hammers, crushing the hardened ash beneath their feet, while Khmer spellcasters hurled bolts of raw lightning that scorched the brass armor of their enemies, leaving blackened scorch marks on the mechanical joints. The air smelled of burning oil, blood, and sulfur. While the main armies fought out in the open air, Nerevar led a small group of his trusted commanders away from the central fighting. Vorin Dagoth, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil followed him through the falling ash. They slipped past the colossal bronze gates at the front of the stronghold, stepping through the thick dust raised by the massive battle, and entered a narrow side fissure leading deep into the crust of the earth. The clashing metal and shouting warriors faded into the background, replaced by the steady, rhythmic thrumming of magma moving through the rock. The group moved down the steep, carved stone stairs of the Dwemer citadel. Glow tubes filled with trapped luminescent gases cast a pale blue light over the polished brass walls. Nerevar kept his grip tight on his blade as they rounded each corner, his boots stepping softly over the metal floor grates. Vorin Dagoth walked close behind him, his eyes scanning the shadowed alcoves where dormant mechanical spiders lay coiled in the dark. The air grew hotter with every step downward, thick with the scent of heated copper and sulphurous fumes. Sweat gathered on the brows of the Khmer commanders. They walked past the main barracks and the great tonal forges, taking paths mapped out by Vorin Dagoth from his earlier infiltration of the mountain. Heavy, pressurized doors blocked the passage, and the group worked the complex bronze locking mechanisms. Air hissed sharply as the thick metal seals broke, allowing the massive doors to swing open on heavily greased hinges. The infiltrators stepped through the final threshold and emerged onto a wide, suspended walkway hanging over a vast lake of molten rock. The intense heat blistered their skin and dried their mouths instantly. At the center of the immense cavern stood a colossal platform of Dwemer metal, ringed by towering steam vents and complex tonal resonators. Copper pipes wrapped around massive brass pillars, feeding pressurized steam into the intricate machinery. In the very middle of the platform rested the heart of Lorcan. It pulsed with a deep crimson light, casting shifting red shadows against the cavern walls. A low, vibrating hum emanated from the stone, shivering the air itself and rattling the teeth of the Chimer commanders. Waiting on the platform were Dwemer Dwarf King and Chief Tonal Architect Kagranak. Dwemer wore thick layers of geometric brass armor, gripping a heavy warhammer in both hands. The plates of his armor caught the red light of the heart and the orange glow of the lava below. Beside him, Kagranak stood directly in front of the glowing heart, holding the tools he had forged. The heavy, enchanted gauntlet Wraithguard encased his left arm, shimmering with a faint, metallic aura. The short, intricate blade keening rested in his right hand, reflecting the deep red pulse of the stone. The heavy hammer sunder lay on a brass worktable near his hip, ready to be drawn. Nerevar walked across the metal bridge toward the center platform, his footsteps ringing out over the sound of bubbling magma. Dwemer turned to face him, the intense heat illuminating the soot and sweat on his face. The two leaders stood paces apart, the deep hum of the heart filling the space between them. Nerevar planted his boots firmly onto the brass floor, adjusting his grip on the leather-wrapped hilt of his sword. He raised the blade up, pointing the sharp steel tip directly at Dwemer's chest. The reflection of the magma danced along the flat of the Chimer weapon. Dwemer tightened his thick, gauntleted fingers on the haft of his hammer, shifting his heavy frame to bear the weight of the metal armor. The gears in Dwemer's joints whirred and clicked with his movements, echoing over the low vibration of the cavern. Kagranak remained by the heart, his eyes darting between the Chimer intruders and the pulsing stone. Vorin Dagoth, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil spread out along the perimeter of the platform, raising their own weapons and blocking the walkways. Ash from the surface still clung to their cloaks, mixing with the sweat running down their faces. Nerevar lunged forward, swinging his sword toward the Dwarf King, and Dwemer brought his heavy hammer down in a massive, sweeping arc. Bronze weapons strike chitin shields inside the cavern beneath the mountain. Steam vents release plumes of white mist as Chimer warriors push forward against the heavy brass armor of the Dwemer guards. The air smells of sulfur, hot copper, and fresh blood. In the center of this massive stone room, the heart of Lorcan hangs suspended within a cradle of metal scaffolding. It pulses with a deep red light, casting long, moving shadows across the walls with every beat. The floor vibrates, sending tremors up through the boots of the soldiers fighting below. High King Dwemer stands between the encroaching Chimer forces and the chief tonal architect Kagranak. Dwemer wears thick, overlapping plates of dwarven metal, gripping a heavy warhammer in both hands. Sparks fly as curved blades collide with his armor. The accounts recorded by the surrounding cultures describe the next moments in different ways. The Chimer records show Indoril Nerevar stepping into the reach of the Dwarf King. Nerevar ducks beneath a heavy swing and drives his long blade through the small gaps beneath Dwemer's arm. The blade pierces deep, and Dwemer drops his hammer, collapsing onto the hot stone floor. The songs of the Nords tell of the Ash King Wulfharth standing in that same chamber. Wulfharth opens his mouth and releases a physical wave of sound. The force of the shout shatters the brass plates on Dwemer's chest, throwing the king backward until his body strikes the cavern wall and slides to the ground. The tapestries woven in the southern deserts of elsewhere show the great feline warrior, Dwemer, leaping from a high steam pipe. The Khajiit lands directly on Dwemer's shoulders, driving his claws through the leather straps of the king's breastplate and bringing him down under his massive weight. In the center of the room, Nerevar lowers his weapon. He looks down at the broken body of Dwemer. Nerevar drops to his knees on the hard floor. He places his bare hands on the dented metal of Dwemer's armor. Red blood pools around his knees, slowly flowing into the carved grooves of the stone. Nerevar stares at his own hands, his fingers trembling, his head bowed forward over the chest of the ally he once called a brother. A few paces away, Khagrenac watches his king fall. The chief tonal architect stands directly beneath the pulsing red light of the heart of Lorkhan. He breathes in short, rapid gasps, his chest heaving under his ornate robes. On his left hand, he wears Wraithguard, a thick gauntlet of interlocking brass rings, spinning gears, and glowing conduits. His right hand grips Sunder, a heavy hammer with a flat, enchanted head. In the fingers of the heavy gauntlet, he holds Keening, a short blade carved from a single sharp blue crystal. The red light of the heart reflects off the facets of the blade. Khagrenac's knuckles turn white around the handles of the tools. Drops of sweat roll down his forehead, gathering in his thick beard. He looks at the body of Dwemer, lying motionless in the growing pool of blood. He turns his head to the left, watching Vorin Dagoth and the other Khmer generals stepping over the broken remnants of dwarven machines. The Khmer soldiers form a tight ring, their weapons drawn, their boots scraping against the stone. They block the ramps, the stairwells, and the archways. They step closer, narrowing the circle around the center of the room, their eyes fixed on the remaining Dwemer. The heat radiating from the massive stone warms Khagrenac's face. The humming of the heart grows louder, vibrating through the metal soles of his boots and rattling the tools in his hands. He looks at the drawn swords of the Khmer, closing in on him. He turns his back to the approaching soldiers. Khagrenac faces the huge glowing stone. He plants his feet firmly on the platform. He raises his arms, lifting the heavy mallet Sunder and the crystalline blade Keening high into the red light, pointing them directly at the beating surface of the god's heart. Dwemer lay dead on the stone floor of the central chamber, his blood pooling in the carved grooves of the obsidian rock. Lord Nerevar stood over him, holding his crimson-stained blade, while Vorin Dagoth and the Khmer commanders flanked the edges of the room. Across the cavern, Chief Tonal Architect Khagrenac stood with his back to the massive, suspended form of the heart of Lorkhan. The vast cavern grew loud, with the hiss of venting steam and the rhythmic striking of heavy brass pistons as the Khmer warriors tightened their circle around the last remaining Dwemer leader in the room. Khagrenac looked down at the fallen dwarf king, and then he looked at the Khmer forces advancing with their raised weapons. The architect retreated a few steps up the metal gantry, stepping closer to the hovering, glowing mass of the divine heart. He reached for the artifacts he had spent years forging. He slid his left hand into the heavy, articulated brass fingers of Wraithguard, securing the thick straps over his forearm. With his right hand, he gripped the haft of Sunder, the heavy enchanted hammer, while Keening, the short blade, rested in a harness at his waist. Vivek and Nerevar shouted commands to their soldiers, charging up the steps to subdue the architect. As they sprinted forward, Khagrenac turned his body completely away from them. He raised Sunder high above his head, the brass head of the hammer reflecting the deep red light pulsing from the heart of Lorkhan. He brought the hammer down, striking the center of the fleshy, glowing mass. A blinding flash of white light erupted from the point of impact, followed by a shockwave that cracked the stone pillars and knocked the Khmer warriors to their knees. The air in the chamber burned with the smell of ozone and singed hair. A high-pitched, ringing tone cut through the sound of the steam vents, vibrating the teeth and bones of every mortal inside the mountain. Kagranak dropped Sunder to the floor, where it clattered against the metal grating, and he immediately drew Keening from his belt. Holding the blade with the metal-clad fingers of Wraithguard, he slashed across the surface of the heart to focus the raw, volatile energy spilling out from the hammer's blow. The tone shifted into a deafening frequency, and the red light filled the cavern entirely. Nerevar shielded his eyes with his arm, watching through narrowed slits as the light engulfed Kagranak and his personal guard. The flesh of the Dwemer architect began to waver, losing its solidity, turning into a silhouette of shimmering golden dust. In the span of a single breath, Kagranak collapsed into ash. The heavy brass plates of his armor plummeted to the floor, crashing against the metal walkways. Wraithguard slipped from his dissolving arm, hitting the stone next to Sunder and Keening. The Dwemer guards standing near the doorway dissolved in the exact same manner, their weapons and breastplates falling into empty piles of metal. The ringing tone ceased, leaving only the hum of the machinery and the bubbling of the lava far below. Nerevar, Vivek and Vorin Dagoth stood up, gripping their weapons, scanning the shadows for an ambush. They found only the scattered armor of their enemies. Kagranak was gone. His guards were gone. The tonal architects working in the lower tiers of the chamber had vanished, leaving their tools spinning on the workbenches. This dissolution extended far beyond the confines of Red Mountain. At that exact moment, across the entire continent of Tamriel, every living Dwemer experienced the same sudden unraveling. In the deep mines of Skyrim, Dwemer laborers turned into golden dust mid-swing, causing their heavy pickaxes to strike the rock walls and fall to the cavern floors. In the great observatories of Hammerfell, astronomers gazing through thick glass lenses dissolved into thin air, leaving their heavy robes draped over their brass stools. Across the underground cities of Resdain, merchants, soldiers and children simply ceased to exist, their bodies turning to ash and drifting away on the drafty subterranean winds. The great subterranean highways, normally packed with marching patrols and rumbling steam carts, fell completely silent. Water continued to pump through the aqueducts, and the automated mechanical spiders continued to scuttle along the brass pipes, repairing gears and replacing valves for masters who would never return. The sprawling dining halls sat with warm plates of food resting on the long stone tables. Forgace burned hot, melting down ores that would eventually overflow their crucibles and spill onto the empty walkways. Every member of the race, from the highest tonal architect to the lowest apprentice, vanished from the physical world at the exact moment Kagranak struck the heart of Lorcan with his enchanted tools. The Khmer generals inside the mountain chamber gathered around the discarded gauntlet, hammer, and blade, staring at the empty spaces where their bitter rivals had stood just seconds before. The great war for the fate of the mountain had ended, replaced by an overwhelming stillness that settled over the discarded armor. Kagranak brought the enchanted hammer Sunder down upon the heart of Lorcan. A shockwave of tonal magic rippled outward from the center of Red Mountain, vibrating through the basalt rock, the volcanic ash, and the deep subterranean soil of Tamriel. At the exact moment the hammer struck the divine flesh, the physical bodies of every Dwemer vanished from the mortal world. Deep in the western deserts of Volenfell, a Dwemer weaponsmith stood at an anvil, holding a glowing rod of brass with a pair of heavy iron tongs. The smith disappeared, causing the iron tongs to clatter onto the stone floor. The brass rod rolled off the anvil, scorching the rock before cooling into a dull brown husk. In the vast underground caverns of Blackreach in Skyrim, miners swung their picks at glowing geode veins. The miners vanished mid-swing. Their heavy steel picks fell into the dirt, landing beside empty leather aprons and brass goggles. In the grand dining halls of Batharzel, roasted meats rested on golden platters. Goblets dropped to the floor, spilling purple wine across the polished stone tables. Empty robes collapsed into heaps on the chairs. The machines alone occupied the sprawling underground cities. Boiling water continued to churn inside the massive geothermal boilers. Steam vented through the brass pipes, hissing continuously into the empty corridors. The mechanical spheres rolled along their designated metal tracks, scanning the halls for their vanished masters. Centurions stood in their alcoves, their gears clicking and turning in endless cycles. Dust slowly gathered on the workbenches, settling thickly over open schematics, scattered soul gems, and half-finished animunculi. Spiders of bronze and glass patrolled the grand entryways, tapping their pointed metal legs against the stone, guarding rooms filled with thick dust and shadows. Centuries later, Imperial and Dwemer scholars sit at heavy oak desks in the Imperial city, turning the stiff, crumbling pages of recovered Dwemer logs. They run their fingers over the angular runes carved into brass plates. These scholars dip their quills in black ink and write down translations of Kagranak's complex formulas. The translated texts describe specific tonal rituals designed to connect the entire Dwemer race to the frequency of the heart of Lorkhan. The scholars draw maps and timelines on large parchment scrolls, marking the exact alignment of the vanishing with the battle in the mountain. They calculate the immense magical resonance required to link thousands of individuals across the continent to a single divine source. Mages in the Arcane University observe the magical anomalies left behind in the ruins. They measure the lingering chronocules, physical particles of time, and record severe fluctuations in the progression of days around Red Mountain. These mages chart out a theory known as a dragon break. They draw diagrams on blackboards showing a single line of time fracturing into multiple splintered threads. The tonal magic generated by the tools snapped the linear progression of time itself. The physical forms of the Dwemer slipped through this temporal fracture, ripped completely from the mortal plane. In the cold stone halls of the College of Winterhold, conjurers and theorists argue over the exact destination of the vanished race. One mage stands before a chalkboard, drawing a large circle to represent the mortal plane of Mundus. He draws a chalk arrow pointing outward into the chaotic, swirling depictions of oblivion. He taps the arrow and argues that Kagranak successfully granted his people eternal life by transporting the entire race to an outer realm. He describes the Dwemer walking across strange landscapes of floating rock and violet skies, living forever in a different physical plane. Across the room, an opposing scholar erases the arrow with a damp cloth. He draws a crumbling, jagged line across the circle. He points to a pile of grey ash sitting inside a glass vial on his desk. He argues the tonal frequency vibrated at a pitch that shattered the Dwemer bodies at the atomic level, breaking their flesh and bones down into microscopic dust. The scholars point to the piles of strange ash found near the sandals and robes in the ruins, labeling it the final physical remains of the Deep Elves. The brass cities remained hollow and quiet for thousands of years. The animunculi marched in endless circles, stepping over the rusted tools of their creators. Explorers walked through the dust, packing the abandoned artifacts into wooden crates, concluding the entire race had perished completely. Down in the damp, subterranean cages of the Corprosarium of Tel Fir, heavy mechanical legs clanked against the wet stone floor. A single survivor breathed the foul air, dragging his diseased, bloated body through the dark. Deep beneath the towering mushroom stalks of Tel Fir, a single Dwemer breathes the damp, spore-choked air of the Corprosarium. His name is Yagrum Bagan. He rests on a mechanized platform, equipped with whirring gears and 4 heavy brass spider legs, dragging his swollen, blistered torso across the uneven stone floors. Pustules cover his pale skin, and his limbs hang heavy with the advanced stages of the corpus disease. The affliction swells his flesh, warps his bones, and slowly strips away the sharp edges of his mind. Yagrum survives as the absolute last of his kind, a living relic, decaying in a subterranean cage. While the tonal architects struck the heart of Lorcan deep within the volcanic core of Red Mountain, Yagrum walked the ash-grey landscapes of an outer realm. He traveled far beyond the borders of Mundus, stepping across dimensions composed of floating rock and violet skies. Because he stood on the soil of another plane of existence, the massive tonal shift that swept across Tamriel bypassed his body entirely. The vibrations radiating from Kagranak's enchanted tools rippled through the mortal world, instantly plucking every other Dwemer from their underground cities and the blood-soaked battlefield trenches. Yagrum returned to Nirn days later and found the grand, steam-heated halls of his people entirely empty. He walked through echoing corridors, observing half-finished brass machines on workbenches and plates of untouched food resting on carved stone tables. Before the disappearance, Yagrum held the title of Master Crafter and served directly under Chief Tonal Architect Kagranak. He constructed massive centurions, tuned the great tonal resonators with precision hammers, and measured the exact frequencies of the earth bones. Now, he sits in the dim, green light of bioluminescent fungi, struggling to recall the mathematical formulas he once engraved into metal tablets. The corpus disease clouds his thoughts, creating a physical pressure behind his eyes. He taps his brass legs against the cavern floor in erratic rhythms, muttering fragmented equations and reciting halves of conversations he once had with Dumak Dwarf King. His mechanical chassis releases short bursts of white steam into the cavern, mimicking the Dwemer engines still operating blindly in the ruins above. Divaith Fear, an ancient Dunmer sorcerer, houses Yagrum within this underground medical quarantine. Thick iron bars and heavy wooden doors separate the last dwarf from the rest of the island of Vardenfell. The scent of rotting flesh and bitter alchemical poultices fills the corpusarium. Other victims of the disease shamble through the dark tunnels, scraping their tumor-covered limbs against the jagged volcanic rock. Yagrum avoids them, steering his mechanical base into isolated alcoves where he tinkers with rusted scraps of Dwemer metal. He solders copper wires, bends brass plates with heavy iron tongs, and attempts to rebuild the logic circuits of small spider animunculi. His thick, calloused fingers frequently tremble, causing him to drop tiny, intricate gears into the dirt. For centuries, Yagrum physically wandered the continent in a desperate search for his lost race. He charted paths through the choking ash deserts and mapped the deep lava tubes running beneath the mountains. He dug his hands through the dirt in the abandoned observatories of Skyrim and Hammerfell, reading the dust-covered star charts left behind by the westward expanding clans. He uncovered empty halls, leaking steam pipes, and the clicking claws of Falmer creeping through the shadows. The physical exhaustion of the journey and his prolonged exposure to the ash storms eventually left his body vulnerable to the corpus infection. Now, his travels consist solely of moving his mechanized legs from his cluttered workbench to his straw sleeping mat. Yagram retains fragmented memories of the events that transpired in the heart chamber during the climax of the Battle of Red Mountain. The physical reality of that day remains sealed within the high walls of that subterranean vault. Down in that chamber, the dust settled over the broken bodies of Khmer warriors and Nordic mercenaries, and a heavy silence stretched across the stone floor. Near the center of the room, the heart of Lorcan pulsed with a steady, crimson glow, illuminating the three tools Kagranak abandoned on the ground. Nerevar and his trusted general, Vorin Dagoth, approached the scattered artifacts, their armored boots crunching heavily on the ash and the shattered pieces of brass. Inside the chamber beneath Red Mountain, the air grew thick with the smell of ozone, hot copper, and burnt oil. The mechanical processes of the Dwemer machines continued all around them. Huge bronze gears turned along the walls, and pistons pumped pressurized steam through the damp cavern. On the stone floor lay the physical remnants of the vanished race. Empty suits of brass armor rested in piles of grey ash. Dropped halberds and crossbows clattered against the iron grating as the steam vents exhaled. In the center of the vast room, the heart of Lorcan suspended in a metallic rig. The artifact emitted a steady, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the soles of boots and rattled the loose stones. Indoril Nerevar and Vorin Dagoth stood over the corpse of Dumak Dwarf King. Thick red blood pooled beneath Dumak's shattered armor, spreading across the floor and staining the intricate carvings in the stone. Beside the fallen king rested the artifacts of Kagranak. The heavy brass gauntlet Wraithguard caught the red light of the glowing heart, its surface etched with deep geometric channels. The hammer sunder rested heavy against the stone, its massive head radiating a low, continuous heat. The short blade keening lay nearby, emitting a sharp, high-pitched acoustic frequency that pierced the heavier mechanical sounds of the cavern. Nerevar bent down and picked up the artifacts. The metal of Wraithguard felt hot against his bare skin. He handed the gauntlet, the hammer, and the blade to Vorin Dagoth. Dagoth accepted the items, his arms straining slightly under the sudden weight of sunder. Nerevar looked at the pulsing heart, and then at the tools in Dagoth's hands. The artifacts vibrated with the residual energy of the god's heart, passing a faint electrical charge into the surrounding air. Nerevar instructed Vorin Dagoth to remain in the chamber and guard the tools. He turned and walked back toward the surface, leaving Dagoth alone in the red glow of the cavern. Nerevar climbed the long stone ramps and emerged onto the surface of Red Mountain. Thick grey ash fell from the sky, coating his hair and armor in a pale layer of dust. A heavy silence settled over the slopes, replacing the clash of steel and shouted orders. Khmer soldiers wandered the terrain, kicking at empty suits of Dwemer armor and lowering their spears as they surveyed the quiet battlefield. Nerevar walked past the exhausted soldiers, his boots sinking into the fresh ash, until he reached the command tents at the base of the volcano. The scent of burning wood, seared flesh, and medicinal herbs hung over the camp. Inside the largest tent, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil sat around a heavy wooden map table. Almalexia wiped soot from her golden skin, her armor dented from the day's combat. Vivek wrapped a long linen bandage around a deep cut on his arm, the blood soaking through the white fabric in bright red patches. Sotha Sil studied the topographical lines on the wide parchment map, his ink-stained fingers tracing the subterranean routes into the mountain. Nerevar stepped into the tent, bringing a gust of ash-filled wind with him. He stood before his counselors and detailed the events inside the heart chamber. He described the sudden disappearance of the Dwemer, the fall of Dumak, and the specific artifacts Kagranak used to manipulate the heart. He explained his decision to leave Vorin Dagoth behind, to guard the items while he sought their counsel. The three advisors listened, their eyes fixed on Nerevar. Sotha Sil asked about the specific shape and sound of the tools. Nerevar described the high hum of keening and the immense weight of sunder. The counselors conferred over the wooden table. They spoke of the vibrating metal and the intense heat radiating from the objects, agreeing on the physical danger of leaving them unguarded in the deep caves. Vivek pointed to the map, tracing the exact path back to the central chamber. Almalexia fastened her armor straps and picked up her weapon from the dirt floor. Sotha Sil rolled up the parchment map and slid it into a leather tube at his hip. They reached an agreement to return to the heart chamber together. They would retrieve the artifacts, study their physical properties, and determine a safe method to dispose of them or seal them away from greedy hands. Nerevar and his three counselors left the tent and began the trek back up the ash-covered slopes of Red Mountain. They marched past the remaining Khymer forces, entering the dark stone tunnels of the Dwemer stronghold once more. The air grew hotter with each descending ramp, smelling heavily of sulfur and stagnant subterranean water. Deep below the surface, Vorin Dagoth sat on the stone floor of the central chamber. He held Wraithguard in his lap, his fingers tracing the geometric lines carved into the heavy brass. Keening and Sunder lay by his knees. The heart of Lorcan pulsed in its harness a few yards away. The steady, rhythmic thumping echoed off the high cavern walls, matching the pace of his own heartbeat. Dagoth closed his eyes. The high-pitched frequency of keening blended with the deep, rumbling vibration of the heart. The metal of the artifacts grew warmer in his bare hands. He tightened his grip on the handle of Sunder. The vibrations traveled up his arms, sinking into his flesh and bone. He shifted his weight, pulling the tools closer to his chest, and stared directly into the blinding red light emanating from the center of the room. Deep inside the central chamber of Red Mountain, the air sat thick with the smell of sulfur and scorched copper. Vorin Dagoth sat on the uneven basalt floor, surrounded by the broken armor and lifeless bodies of fallen Dwemer and Khymer warriors. In his lap rested the heavy bronze mass of Wraithguard, the carved metallic handle of Sunder, and the sharp, crystalline edge of Keening. A few paces away, the heart of Lorcan suspended above a pit of bubbling magma. The deep, rhythmic thrumming of the massive stone vibrated through the soles of Dagoth's boots and rattled the teeth in his skull. Nerevar had walked back up the winding tunnels to consult with his advisors, leaving Dagoth alone to guard the instruments. As the hours passed, Dagoth stared intently at the tools. He ran his calloused fingers over the polished metal of Sunder. The radiating heat from the heart washed over his face, raising a thick layer of sweat on his skin. He gripped the tools tight against his chest, listening to the steady, booming rhythm echoing off the cavern walls. His pupils dilated in the dim red light. He began to pace the length of the chamber, dragging his boots through the piled ash, muttering oaths of protection to the empty room. He slid his hand into the heavy gauntlet of Wraithguard, feeling the precise gears and brass plates lock tightly around his forearm. Footsteps echoed down the obsidian corridor, cutting through the low hum of the magma. Nerevar stepped into the red glow of the chamber, followed closely by his counselors, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil. Dust drifted down from the vaulted ceiling as they approached the center of the room. Nerevar extended his bare hand, his palm open and facing upward, waiting for the tools to be placed into his grasp. Dagoth took a heavy step backward, his boots grinding against the loose gravel. He kept Wraithguard secured on his arm and pulled Keening close to his side. He planted his feet wide on the uneven rock and spoke loudly over the hum of the heart. He stated he had sworn an oath to keep the items safe and declared he would protect them from any hand that reached for them, including the hand of his commander. Nerevar lowered his arm, and his fingers drifted toward the hilt of his own sword. The three counselors fanned out across the chamber floor, drawing their weapons as they circled the lone guard. Metal scraped against metal as blades left their scabbards. The chamber filled with the sharp ringing of steel clashing in the red light. Sparks showered over the stone floor as Nerevar and the counselors moved against Dagoth. Ash kicked up into the air, coating their armor in a fine grey film. Dagoth swung the heavy tools, his muscles straining under the weight, sweat pouring down his ash-stained face. A blade cut through the gaps in his armor, slicing into his flesh. Blood spilled down Dagoth's side, pooling hot and dark on the cavern floor. He staggered backward, his breathing ragged, his hand pressing hard against the gash. Dropping the tools onto the blood-slicked stone, Dagoth turned and fled deeper into the unlit, winding tunnels of Red Mountain. The sound of his heavy, uneven footsteps faded into the darkness. The Ashlander tribes passed down a slightly different tale around their fires, speaking of Dagoth standing alongside his loyal retainers. In their accounts, the retainers exchanged blows with the counselors in the heat of the chamber before retreating into the shadows alongside their lord, leaving the tools behind on the rock. Nerevar stood over the fallen instruments, wiping the fresh blood from his blade. He looked at Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha-Sil as the dust settled around them. Sotha-Sil bent down, his fingers brushing the polished brass of Wraithguard, and lifted the heavy metal from the ground. They gathered the artifacts from the ash, the thrum of the heart still echoing against the cavern walls, setting the stage for a vow that would shape the future of their entire race. Lord Nerevar, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha-Sil stood in the ash-dusted light outside the entrance to Red Mountain. The three Dwemer tools rested on a flat slab of black basalt. The counselors placed their bare hands over the metal instruments and spoke a vow to leave the artifacts untouched. They bound their words with blood, pressing sharp daggers to their palms and letting crimson drops fall onto the grey stone. The heavy brass gauntlet, the humming crystal blade, and the blunt metal hammer remained perfectly still beneath the settling ash. Shortly after the blood dried on the stone, Nerevar collapsed onto the rocky ground. The Ashlander records describe him lying on a woven fiber mat, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged rhythms as blood seeped from deep lacerations taken during the battle. The wound edges blackened and festered, and soon his lungs stopped pulling in the mountain air, leaving his body completely still. Other texts detail a different sequence of events. These writings describe Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha-Sil standing over Nerevar, holding bone daggers and poisoned spears. The records detail the sharp points piercing Nerevar's skin, severing his veins, and forcing his eyes to roll back into his skull as his blood pooled on the volcanic dirt. With Nerevar's body cooling on the ash, the three counselors walked back to the basalt slab. They reached out and picked up Wraithguard, Keening, and Sunder. The brass and crystal of the tools reflected the harsh sunlight. They turned their backs on the camp and walked down the sloping tunnels into the depths of Red Mountain. The air grew thicker, smelling of sulfur and heated copper. Magma bubbled in deep trenches along the walls, throwing a harsh red glare across their faces and blistering their skin. Their boots clanked against the metal grates of the Dwemer walkways as they stepped onto the central platform where the giant heart of Lorcan pulsed. The massive organ beat with a slow, heavy rhythm, shaking the dust from the ceiling and vibrating the bones within their chests with every thud. Sotha Sil slid his hand into the heavy Dwemer gauntlet. He grasped the handle of Sunder, lifting the hammer high above his shoulder. He brought the blunt end down onto the flesh of the heart. A loud, ringing chime echoed through the cavern, vibrating the surrounding metal pillars. He then took the blade keening and carved precise lines across the divine tissue. The air around the three counselors warped and shimmered like water over a hot fire. Bright white light poured from the cuts in the heart and flowed directly into their chests. Their veins bulged and glowed with blue energy through their skin. They absorbed the raw power, expanding their physical stature, and their bodies began to levitate inches above the stone floor. Outside the mountain, a physical change swept across the land. The Chimer possessed pale golden skin and bright eyes. As the three counselors drew the power of the heart into themselves, the skin of every Chimer in Morrowind darkened. The golden hue shifted to a deep, ashen grey. Their irises flared and settled into a solid, glowing crimson. The physical forms of an entire race shifted in the span of a few heartbeats. The newly formed Dwemer rubbed their grey hands and looked at each other with red eyes, reshaped entirely by the ritual performed deep underground. The three counselors emerged from the tunnels as living gods. They returned to the settlements and issued new commands to their followers. Workers carried heavy blocks of volcanic stone and constructed towering ziggurats in their honor, the chisels ringing out constantly against the rock. The tribunal commanded the scribes to gather the old histories. Soldiers piled the ancient scrolls and parchment records into the courtyards and held torches to the dry paper. The flames consumed the accounts of the oath, the details of Nerevar's death, and the exact origin of their new power. Scribes dipped their quills in fresh ink and wrote new texts, detailing the three achieving divinity through their own perfect virtues. The iron doors of the temple vaults swung shut, locking away the ashes of the old truths. The physical remnants of the Dwemer still littered the landscape across the continent. The deep elves had left a vast network of subterranean fortresses stretching from the ash wastes of Morrowind to the frozen peaks of Skyrim. As the Dwemer settled into their new temples and the underground slaves roamed the dark caverns unchained, the heavy brass doors of the Dwemer cities remained standing. Steam continued to hiss from the copper pipes, and thick gears kept turning on their greased axles, humming with energy. The empty corridors echoed with the sound of grinding metal, waiting for the footsteps of creators who would never walk those halls again. The Chimer warriors marched across the ash wastes of Morrowind, their skin now grey as the dust beneath their boots, and their eyes the colour of fresh blood. They carried weapons of iron and chitin into the strongholds of House Dagoth. They tore the red and black banners from the stone walls and tossed them onto the burning pyres, watching the fabric curl and blacken in the heat. They drove their spears into the chests of the Dagoth retainers they found hiding in the lower corridors, leaving their bodies on the volcanic rock. Some Dagoth survivors knelt in the dirt, stripping off their family crests and donning the sigils of the other great houses. The Dwemer walked into the vast, echoing brass chambers of the Dwemer. They placed their campfires on the metal grates, the smoke rising to coat the golden ceilings in soot. They hung their woven tapestries over the bronze pipes and set their wooden chests on the polished stone floors. They stood on the ridges of the ash-covered mountains and drove their flagpoles into the soil, planting their banners from the coasts of the inner sea to the jagged peaks of the borders. Far to the west, beneath the frozen peaks of Skyrim, the blind Falmer crawled out from the deep caverns. They gripped their weapons carved from Chorus chitin and braced for the steam blasts and bronze blades of their masters. They crept into the great halls, swinging their axes into the metal doors and striking the unmoving brass armor plates lying on the stone floors. They ran their clawed fingers over the cold workbenches, touching the scattered cogs, the unlit soul gems, and the sleeping cots. They stepped over the discarded tongs and the dropped hammers scattered across the stone tiles. The Falmer expanded their camps into the grand atriums. They dragged animal carcasses into the dining halls and built fences of bone and stretched hide across the polished walkways. They led their chorus herds into the testing chambers, letting the insects feed on the glowing mushrooms growing from the cracks in the stone. They stood in the center of the subterranean cities, holding their weapons in the damp air, meeting only the hiss of steam. The Falmer lowered their chitin axes and built their crude huts directly on top of the intricate Dwemer architecture. Above ground, scavengers from various surface tribes pulled open the heavy bronze doors of the outer ruins. They walked down the descending ramps, carrying torches that illuminated the spinning gears and the hissing steam valves. Bandits set up their bedrolls in the upper rooms, stuffing small metal scraps and soul gems into their leather sacks. Many intruders stepped on the copper pressure plates set into the floor tiles. Spinning blades extended from the stone walls and sliced through their armor, spilling their blood across the brass grates. Poisoned darts launched from narrow slits in the ceilings, piercing the necks and shoulders of the explorers. Bronze spiders dropped from the metal tubes overhead and drove their sharp limbs into the chests of the intruders. Dwarven spheres unfolded from metal balls into mechanical warriors, firing heavy crossbow bolts into the raiding parties. Great mechanical giants powered by steam pistons walked out of the alcoves and swung their heavy mallets into the rib cages of the looters. The surviving scavengers dropped their torches and ran back up the ramps, carrying their wounded and leaving the deeper vaults undisturbed. Inside those deepest chambers, the large gear wheels continued to rotate along their steel axles. Water boiled inside the heavy copper boilers, and the resulting steam pushed through the network of pipes spanning the ceilings. The animunculi marched in precise squares across the stone floors. The mechanical spiders crawled along the metal tracks, polishing the brass fixtures and tightening the loose bolts with their clawed appendages. The lighting systems emitted a blue glow across the hallways as the soul gems vibrated in their metal brackets. The massive dwarven centurions stood in their charging stations, steam venting from their joints in regular intervals. The pistons pumped up and down, the pendulums swung back and forth, and the water wheels turned in the underground rivers. The gears pushed the levers, and the levers turned the valves in an ongoing physical loop. Beneath the ash and the rock of Red Mountain, deep inside the volcanic crater, the lava bubbled and popped against the black stone shores. The enchanted tools of Kagranak rested on the ground, surrounded by the discarded armor pieces of the Chimer generals. Next to a jagged pillar of basalt, a figure lay face down in the volcanic soot. The man wore a heavy golden mask with 3 eye slits, his limbs covered in deep, bleeding lacerations. He pushed his hands into the thick ash and lifted his torso off the ground. He dragged his feet across the hot stones, moving step by step toward the massive, beating stone heart suspended above the lava pool. The relic pulsed, emitting a low, booming vibration that shook the loose pebbles on the ground. He reached out his hands, spreading his trembling fingers, and placed his palms directly against the glowing surface of the stone. warriors of the great houses marched through the estates of House Dagoth, carrying torches and heavy iron mauls. They tore down the banners of the sixth house, tossing the red and black cloth into roaring fires that sent thick, pungent smoke into the sky. Spears shattered wooden crests, and heavy boots trampled the ashes of burned scrolls. Scribes took chisels to the stone monuments, scraping away the name of Vorin Dagoth and his kin until only raw, unmarked rock remained. The victors took the surviving members of the bloodline, stripping them of their familial colors and placing them into the ranks of the other houses, dressing them in new armor to serve new lords. The ash from the burning strongholds settled over the courtyards, mixing with the mud. The scribes of the tribunal wrote new histories on fresh vellum, recording the triumph of the living gods and leaving the pages bare of the sixth house. Deep beneath the crust of Red Mountain, far below the reach of the tribunal's armies, Vorin Dagoth drew breath in the heavy, sulphur-scented air. He lay on the heated stone of the great cavern, surrounded by the discarded machinery of the Dwemer. Blood from his battle with Nerevar and the councillors pooled on the basalt floor, slowly baking into a dark crust in the volcanic heat. He crawled across the uneven ground toward the center of the chamber, where the heart of Lorcan rested. The stone pulsed with a steady, rhythmic thrum, vibrating through the rock and up into his hands as he pressed his palms against the cavern floor. During his time guarding the tools of Kagrenac, Vorin had experimented with the tonal metals. He had struck the heart, absorbing the deep sound waves and the intense heat radiating from the divine artifact. This frequency embedded itself deeply into his flesh and bones. As he pulled himself closer to the beating stone, the energy flowed directly into him, turning his skin an ashen gray and sharpening his fingernails into long, dark claws. He pressed his face to the warm rock. The power of the heart surged through his veins, expanding his muscles and filling his lungs with boiling air. He drew the energy with complete abandon, opening his mind entirely to the raw, untamed frequency of the artifact. He fashioned a mask of golden metal, shaping it with fixed, staring eyes and a radiating sunburst crest, and fastened it over his face. He sat beside the heart for centuries. The heat baked the cavern, and magma bubbled in the deep pools around him, casting flickering orange light across the brass walls. He paced the chamber, dragging his claws along the metal pipes and speaking loudly to the rising steam. He formed endless looping sentences about betrayal and revenge, shouting his plans into the cavernous expanse. He channeled the heart's power outward, pushing his thoughts into the minds of the creatures sleeping in the ash wastes above. Red dust began to blow out from the mountain's crater, carrying his dreams across the island. He commanded the ash and the blighted winds, his physical form growing larger and more imposing as he consumed the divine energy. He infected the creatures of the mountain with a rapidly swelling sickness, causing their flesh to mutate and bulge with weeping tumors and twisted bone growths. These creatures became his followers, walking blindly through the thick ash storms to do his bidding, carrying the disease outward to the settlements of Vardenfell. He looked up at the vast, echoing space of the cavern chamber. The Dwemer had left behind massive scaffolding, thick chains of blackened iron, and gears taller than a netch. Vorin Dagoth began to gather these pieces. He directed his newly corrupted followers, the Sleepers and the Ash Vampires, to drag the heavy Dwemer metal across the stone floor. They piled the brass struts and copper pipes near the heart. He envisioned a new construct, a towering framework of metal and bone, built to mirror the original works of Kagrenac. The followers welded the first massive joints together, striking heavy iron hammers against the glowing brass. They began constructing a giant humanoid golem, securing the thick metal ribs directly above the beating heart, preparing to give life to a second mechanical god. Deep inside the central caldera of Red Mountain, magma bubbles in wide open pools and casts a bright crimson glow across the jagged rock walls. The air smells of burning sulfur, hot iron, and roasting meat. At the center of this massive underground chamber stands a towering, half-built golem named Akula Khan. Workers with grey skin, distorted limbs, and ash-choked lungs climb across wooden scaffolding surrounding the giant construct. They hammer brass plates, weld Dwemer scrap metal, and bind carved bone into a towering humanoid shape. Long tubes of copper and glass run through the golem's limbs, pumping glowing fluids into its joints. Dagoth stands on a stone bridge overlooking the work, watching his followers assemble this second Numidium piece by piece. In the hollow cavity of the golem's chest, suspended by heavy metal struts and pulsating with a harsh red light, rests the heart of Lorcan. The ancient organ pulses in a steady, heavy rhythm, shaking the loose pebbles on the cavern floor and sending ripples across the surface of the magma pools with every beat. Dagoth directs the construction, plotting to march the giant machine across the surface of Morrowind to crush the great houses and the tribunal. High above the cavern, on the blackened and broken slopes of the volcano, thick ash storms tear across the ridges. Almalexia and Sotha Sil march through the blowing soot, their boots crunching over layers of grey dust. Almalexia wears heavy armor of polished gold, while Sotha Sil moves with the whirring sound of hidden clockwork mechanisms built into his silver plates. They carry the ancient artifacts, Sunder and Keening, in their hands, returning to the mountain to bathe in the power of the heart, as they had done for centuries. As they step through a narrow ravine of sharp basalt, dark figures emerge from the blinding ash. Dagoth ash vampires, towering creatures with elongated limbs, sharp claws, and hollowed trunk-like faces, leap from the rocks. Blades strike against golden shields, and bursts of raw magical fire light up the grey storm. The air fills with the smell of ozone, burning ash, and spilled blood. The ash vampires swarm Almalexia and Sotha Sil, pressing them into the jagged stones with sheer numbers and feral strength. Claws rake across Almalexia's golden breastplate, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Sotha Sil unleashes blasts of lightning from his fingertips, scorching the rocks, yet more creatures pour from the crevices. The enchanted hammer Sunder falls from Sotha Sil's grasp and lands heavily in the dirt. A moment later, the sharp blade Keening slips from Almalexia's fingers and clatters against the stones. The ash vampires pin the two gods to the ground, tearing at their armor. As the creatures prepare to drag the fallen gods into the mountain, Vivek descends from the heavy clouds. He wields his spear, driving the ash vampires back with wide, sweeping strikes that cut through the thick air. Vivek grabs Almalexia by her shoulder and hauls the bleeding Sotha Sil to his feet. He pulls them away from the ambush, dragging them down the steep inclines of the volcano. They retreat down the mountain, leaving the ancient artifacts buried in the volcanic dust. The blowing storm quickly swallows their tracks. Inside the deep chamber below, Dagoth soon holds Sunder and Keening in his clawed hands. He runs his fingers over the heavy, flat head of the hammer and the sharp, humming edge of the short blade. He holds the exact tools required to strike and flay the power of the heart. He possesses the instruments of Kagranak, yet his hands are bare. The heavy golden gauntlet Wraithguard remains far away in the city of Vivek, worn on the arm of the warrior poet himself. Dagoth grips the handle of Keening, and the raw magic scorches the flesh of his palm. Blisters form and pop along his fingers as the direct contact with the energy burns his skin. He sets the hammer and blade aside on a carved stone pedestal, nursing his blackened hands. He watches his workers continue to weld brass and bone onto the vast frame of Akula Khan. The towering golem grows larger with each passing day. The heart beats louder, vibrating through the deep roots of the mountain. Outside the crater, the ash blows across the magical barrier of the ghost fence and settles over the giant mushroom forests and muddy swamps of Vardenfell. The wind carries the soot across the churning salt water of the inner sea. In the distance, beneath a sky thick with grey clouds, a wooden prison ship cuts through the dark waves. The vessel sails toward the coastal port of Seyda-Neen, rocking heavily in the tide. Below the wooden decks, resting in the damp hold smelling of salt and pitch, a lone prisoner sleeps, sent by the Emperor to walk the path of an ancient prophecy. In the year 3E 427, a wooden prison ship anchored at the docks of Seyda-Neen on the island of Vardenfell. A prisoner walked down the wooden gangplank, placing heavy boots onto the damp planks of the pier, while the local guards stood nearby in armor forged from overlapping plates of insect chitin. The air smelled of salt water and burning hearth fires from the nearby village. Emperor Uriel Septim VII sent this outlander across the sea from the central province of Cyrodiil. The local Dwemer watched the outlander from the shadows of muddy streets, tracking the stranger with narrow red eyes. In dusty libraries, scholars unrolled parchment scrolls on wooden tables, tracing their fingers over faded ink that detailed the return of Indoril Nerevar. The outlander wore the title of the Nerevarine, stepping onto the island with a heavy iron sword and a leather pack slung over one shoulder. The Nerevarine walked the long, ash-covered roads of Vardenfell, trudging through thick layers of grey powder. The ash blew through the air, sticking to the traveller's cloak and coating their boots. The outlander climbed the high stone steps of Vivek City, a massive settlement built on floating cantons of rock over the water. Inside the high fane, the polished stone walls reflected the flickering torchlight, and ordinators in golden masks stood perfectly still by the large wooden doors. The tribunal god Vivek sat floating above the stone floor. His skin showed a stark division down the center, one half a golden yellow and the other half a dark ashen grey. He handed over a heavy gauntlet made of overlapping brass scales. This gauntlet, Wraithguard, carried the weight of thick Dwemer metal, and it vibrated against the palm, producing a low, continuous humming sound. The Nerevarine marched toward the jagged peaks of Red Mountain. The soft ash gave way to cracked black basalt. Rivers of orange lava flowed through deep trenches in the rock, radiating intense heat that singed the edges of the outlander's cloak. The outlander descended into the dark tunnels of the Sixth House citadels. Inside, cultists in red robes chanted in low, rhythmic voices. The air smelled of metallic blood and the heavy smoke of burning incense. Misshapen creatures covered in swollen tumors dragged their heavy limbs across the stone floors. The Nerevarine swung steel blades and cast arcs of fire to clear the path. Deep within these strongholds, resting on stone pedestals, sat the remaining Dwemer artifacts. The outlander grabbed the heavy wooden handle of the hammer sunder. Beside it rested the short, crystalline blade of Keening. The translucent blade emitted a high-pitched ringing sound when pulled from the stone table. The Outlander fastened Wraithguard onto their right hand. The brass plates locked into position around the fingers and wrist, protecting the skin and bone beneath from the volatile magic of the tools. With the hammer secured on a thick leather belt and the blade sheathed at the hip, the Nerevarine walked deeper into the core of Red Mountain. The narrow tunnel widened into a massive cavernous space. The heat in the cavern caused the air to ripple, distorting the shapes of the rocks. A walkway made of Dwemer metal stretched across the expanse, suspended over a wide pit of bubbling lava. The magma popped and hissed far below, sending plumes of sulphurous smoke up toward the ceiling. At the far end of the cavern stood the massive frame of a Kulakan. The colossal golem reached toward the high stone ceiling, constructed from massive cogs, pistons, and thick sheets of brass. Brass tubes pumped steaming fluids through its metallic limbs. In the center of its open chest cavity hung the heart of Lorcan. The heart expanded and contracted with a deep, steady rhythm, mimicking a muscle pumping blood. A red glow emanated from the organ, casting long, shifting shadows across the cavern walls. Standing on the platform before the heart was Dagoth-Ur. He wore a golden mask with 3 eye slits and a sunburst pattern radiating from the forehead. His skin looked grey and hardened, marked by centuries of exposure to the ash and the heat of the cavern. He raised his hands, and the metal braces on his wrists clinked together. His voice echoed off the rock walls, carrying across the metal bridge. He held a staff in one hand, resting the heavy wooden tip on the metal grating of the floor. The Nerevarine stepped onto the metal bridge, and the brass gauntlet Wraithguard clicked with every movement of the hand. The Outlander drew the crystal blade keening, reflecting the red light of the heart in its sharp edge. The long walk across the bridge brought the Outlander face to face with Dagoth-Ur, with the massive golem towering above them both. The Nerevarine raised the hammer sunder in the air, preparing to bring the heavy metal head crashing down upon the surface of the glowing heart to shatter the ancient enchantments binding it to the cavern. The Outlander stepped onto the narrow metal bridge suspended directly over the caldera of Red Mountain. Heat radiated upward from the molten rock, blistering the skin and filling the cavern with the smell of sulfur and burning copper. At the center of the chamber, the heart of Lorcan rested within a thick cradle of Dwemer metal. It expanded and contracted, pushing deep vibrations through the basalt floor and rattling the teeth in the Outlander's skull. Dagoth-Ur stood between the Outlander and the heart, his tall, ash-gray body adorned with a golden mask. He raised his clawed hands, gathering sparks of red magic at his fingertips. The Outlander slipped the heavy brass bulk of Wraithguard over their left hand. The gauntlet hissed as its internal gears locked into place, emitting a faint blue light that shielded the flesh inside from the intense gravity of the room. The Outlander gripped the thick handle of sunder. The hammer glowed, venting tiny jets of steam from its sides. Dodging a burst of red energy from Dagoth-Ur, the Outlander sprinted past the masked figure and brought sunder down directly upon the center of the heart of Lorcan. A sharp, deafening crack echoed off the cavern walls. The impact sent a visible shockwave through the heavy air, physically throwing Dagoth-Ur backward onto the grates. The strike fractured the ancient Dwemer tonal enchantments, holding the heart in place. The mass of flesh and stone shuddered violently, leaking a brilliant, blinding white light from the point of impact. The Outlander dropped sunder onto the metal grating. Drawing keening from their belt, the Outlander prepared for the next step. The short blade hummed, vibrating rapidly in the reinforced grip of the Wraithguard. The Outlander drove keening directly into the glowing tissue of the heart, dragging the blade downward. With each strike of the tuning blade, The tone within the cavern pitched higher, resembling the screech of tearing metal. The frequency shattered the glass tubes, copper wires, and brass pipes connecting the heart to the towering, incomplete body of Akula Khan. The massive, skinless golem hung in the shadows of the cavern walls, its exposed metal joints and wooden scaffolding groaning under the shifting vibrations. The Outlander struck the heart a final time. A shockwave of pure light flooded the chamber, turning everything solid white for a fraction of a second. The heart of Lorcan shrank in on itself, folded inward, and vanished entirely from the physical plane. Only an empty brass cradle and severed pipes remained on the platform. The sudden absence of the heart instantly severed the connection, feeding Dagoth-Ur's body. His tall frame folded, dropping to his knees on the metal grating. His muscles shrank, and his skin sagged against his bones. He gasped, clutching his throat as centuries of decay rushed back into his veins. The rock walls around the cavern began to splinter. The massive construct, Akula Khan, completely destabilized. Huge chunks of brass, carved stone, and scaffolding detached from the golem's frame, plummeting downward and splashing into the boiling magma below. Dagoth-Ur lost his footing as the bridge shook. He pitched forward, falling into the molten rock alongside the crumbling pieces of the second brass god. The magma consumed him, leaving only churning red liquid and a plume of black smoke. The intense vibrations stopped entirely. The deafening hum of Dwemer machinery faded into absolute silence. The Outlander stood alone on the remaining metal walkways, listening to the popping bubbles of magma and the shifting of loose stones against the cavern walls. The gears and tonal resonators, designed by Kagranak, sat motionless in the smoke-filled crater. The tonal bindings lay broken, and the legendary tools rested on the scorching metal floor. The Outlander leaned down, gathering sunder and keening, securing them alongside the Wraith Guard. The artifacts survived the collapse, carrying their immense stored energy back to the surface of Morrowind. As the volcanic ash settled over the mountain, these tools would eventually pass from hand to hand, traveling across borders and waiting for a new era to uncover their enduring power in the frozen lands of Skyrim. Ash falls across the roads of Morrowind in the 5th year of the 4th era. The Red Mountain erupts, sending thick grey clouds into the sky and burying the stone settlements under layers of hot pumice and soot. Refugees walk westward through the mountain passes, towards Skyrim, wearing ash-stained cloaks and pulling wooden carts filled with salvaged clothing and iron pots. Among these crowds of displaced travelers walk smugglers with heavy canvas packs. Wrapped inside oiled cloth and thick leather at the very bottom of their bags sit Sunder and Wraithguard. The heavy brass plates of the gauntlet and the dense metallic head of the hammer rest in the dark, carried over the snowy borders of Skyrim. The thieves step through the frost, carrying the ancient tonal instruments toward the arid sands of Hammerfell to trade for gold coins. The third tool takes a different physical path. A courier carries Keening through the freezing winds of the northern mountains, trudging through deep snowdrifts until the freezing temperatures freeze his limbs. He collapses into the powder, and the frost coats his body, encasing the brass blade wrapped in his pack in solid ice. Snow falls and melts across the mountain, passes over many decades, until travelers pull the blade from the frost. Keening eventually finds its way to the circular stone halls of the College of Winterhold. A scholar named Arniel Gain claims the blade. He places a warped, glowing purple soul gem on a heavy wooden table inside a dimly lit stone chamber. He studies the brass handle and the sharp, translucent crystalline edge of keening under the steady flame of a wax candle. Arniel holds the physical tools necessary to replicate the exact tonal frequency Kagranak struck beneath the mountain. Arniel grips the handle of keening. He raises the blade above his shoulder and strikes the warped soul gem with the crystal edge. A sudden burst of bright yellow light flashes across the stone walls of the room, illuminating the dust motes hanging in the air and casting harsh black shadows against the floor. The light fades rapidly. The wooden table remains standing, and the warped soul gem sits quietly in its center. Keening drops to the stone floor with a sharp metallic clatter. Arniel Gain vanishes from the room. He leaves behind the bare stone room and the lingering hum of the crystal blade, perfectly recreating the exact physical vanishing of the ancient tonal architects. Far below the reach of the sunlight, the brass cities of the Dwemer sit beneath the heavy rock and soil of Skyrim. Steam hisses from copper pipes, and giant golden gears turn endlessly in the damp, echoing caverns. Crawling over these turning cogs and carved stone walkways are the Falmer. They possess pale, hairless skin, pointed ears, and entirely white, clouded eyes. They wear armor carved from the heavy shells of giant underground insects and carry curved swords crafted from hardened chitin. They listen to the grinding of the metal machines, walking through the vast halls their ancient masters built. The Falmer inhabit the stone dormitories, building tents of stretched animal hide directly over the intricately paved brass floors. They drag the bones of cave bears and blind cave fishes across the metal grates. The Dwemer machines continue to pump water and vent hot steam, while the golden mechanical spiders roll on their metal legs past the pale creatures scurrying over the pipes. The animunculi patrol the glowing corridors, the Falmer hunt in the deep shadows, and the massive stone doors stand heavily sealed against the surface world. The heavy architecture stands exactly as it did on the day the tonal architects struck the heart. The enchanted tools rest in new hands, the subterranean machines run on their endless loops, and the mutated slaves roam the dark caverns. The physical remnants of an entire civilization wait in the stone, pointing directly to the final remaining riddle of that single moment beneath the red volcano. The surviving documents stored in the libraries of Tamriel contain a small collection of verified details regarding the Battle of Red Mountain. Scholars run their fingers over brittle parchment and read the exact same sequence of physical events. The Dwemer stood inside the vast chamber of the heart of Lorkhan. Kagranak held the metal tools, gripping the heavy brass of Wraithguard, the dense head of Sunder, and the sharp edge of Keening. He stepped toward the glowing divine stone and struck the heart with the hammer and the blade. At that exact moment, the bodies of the Dwemer vanished from the physical world. The bronze armor they wore clattered to the stone floors. Their weapons dropped into the dirt. The records written by the Chimer generals and the Nordic commanders described the unattended swords and dropped armor laying in the ash. The remaining accounts consist of varied interpretations, written by scribes who watched the events from afar and recorded their own beliefs about the sudden departure. Certain leather-bound tomes propose a physical displacement into an outer realm. The scholars who penned these books suggest the Dwemer successfully harnessed the heart to separate their physical forms from Mundus, relocating their entire population to a plane outside the boundaries of the known world. The text outlines a realm of pure logic and mathematics, where the Dwemer continue to build their brass towers and steam-powered halls. Other heavy, dust-covered books offer a description of total physical annihilation. These pages state the tonal frequencies generated by the tools disrupted the physical structure of the Dwemer. The authors describe the bodies of the deep elves turning into microscopic ash and scattering into the void, consumed by a power they attempted to control. Only the stone walls of the Red Mountain Chamber hold the actual physical imprint of those final moments. The physical evidence left behind consists of massive underground cities stretching across the continent. Explorers walk through long corridors constructed of interlocking bronze plates and heavy stone blocks. Steam hisses from copper pipes set into the walls, clouding the air with moisture. Giant cogs and gears turn continuously, driven by volcanic heat and flowing subterranean water. The mechanical spiders and towering centurions patrol the walkways, their metal feet clanking against the floor grates. They guard dust-covered armories, silent living quarters, and grand observation chambers filled with spinning astrological dials. In the deepest sections of these ruins, the Falmer crawl over the ancient architecture, carving bone weapons and breeding insectoid beasts in the shadows of the flawless machinery. The legacy of the Deep Elves amounts to these abandoned cities functioning in the dark. The fire in the hearth before you burns down to glowing orange embers, and the heat radiates outward to warm the heavy woolen blankets resting on your shoulders. The thick wooden logs pop, sending tiny yellow sparks drifting up toward the stone chimney. Outside the thick walls of the hall, the snow falls across the mountain peaks, piling on the branches of the pine trees and burying the cobblestone paths. The wind blows against the heavy timber doors, rattling the iron hinges and pushing cold drafts through the gaps in the floorboards. You can ease your muscles into the padded chair and let the warmth seep into your tired limbs. The tale of the vanished elves concludes here, leaving you with the image of their silent halls and spinning gears. The sun will eventually rise over the tundra, bringing light to the frost-covered roads you must walk. Rest your eyes, breathe in the scent of burning pine wood, and gather your strength for the morning. Good night, traveler, and may your road lead you to warm sands.